Nobody ever dares tell the truth about Belgium. Belgium is not a nation. It's an artificial creation. I know the Brits did it. Maybe once again we can be blamed.
Hello, everyone. Genuinely, I'm not just doing the stream because of that very old segment of news from when we were still part of the European Union. No, there are many reasons why I wanted to come to this. People have been nagging me about my weird conception of Belgian history, weird coming from an Anglo point of view. But nevertheless, I brought up that clip from Nigel Farage in terms of contextualizing this whole idea of Belgium not being a fake country, because it underlines quite a few points, especially from an Anglo point of view, maybe even a chauvinistic point of view. It's interesting to consider that there is a school of history which stems from this idea that Belgium is not a nation, Belgium is an artificial creation, and that the Brits were responsible for it. And I would call this the scrap of paper retroactive history. The scrap of paper, weirdly enough, is actually a reference to how the Germans considered the 1839 London Protocol, which quote unquote guaranteed the neutrality of Belgium by the fiat of the various neighboring powers. And by extension, the British perspective is, oh, well, the British were responsible for helping formulate the original scrap of paper in 1839, which quote unquote guaranteed Belgium neutrality. Then we came into World War I ostensibly because of said scrap of paper. And he then goes on to say, Nigel Farage then goes on to say that there is the disparity in language between the Flemish peoples and the Walloons. And as a result of that, because there is language divergence, there also is the justification for it not being a nation. So as you can probably understand, the whole idea that Britain created it, and going back to this idea of us getting involved in World War I because of this bizarre contribution we made to European continental international politics, which was the creation of Belgium. I'm not sure exactly what this stems from. Again, in terms of Nigel Farage's position, it's obviously as a means to demonize the point of demonize the European Union and justify our exiting from it. But I really want to caution against ethno-nationalism, because this is really ethno-nationalism in the sense of deriving explicitly from the legacy of the French Revolution, in the sense that nations can only exist if they fall in line with this very strict adherence to territory defined purely by ethnicity, which helps explain the national factory, the nationalism factory in the 19th century, where all of these new nations, these new national constructs were being popped out of nowhere, and that simply Belgium would fit in with that whole structure. But I'm fascinated in Belgium because Belgium is a historical anachronism. It is an anachronism within an anachronism. And one of the reasons I felt compelled to talk about this topic now is that it forms an offshoot from my series, The Later Hapsburgs, which, as far as it comes to this area, hasn't given this place and its personalities the attention that it perhaps deserves. Partly because you can see Belgium as a smaller iteration of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's one way that you can look at Belgium and say, oh, it's just a geographical expression. You can look to the neoclassicism of the French Revolution and you can say, oh, this is like Helvetia or Batavia or Illyria, hence Belgica, the ancient sort of lands of the quote-unquote sort of Belgican tribes during the time of the Roman Empire. And in that sense, it should be artificial. I'm sure people can draw comparisons between Belgium and Czechoslovakia. In the case of Czechoslovakia, two people who are very distinct, the Slovaks, the Czechs, and in the case of Czechoslovakia, originally the Germans, brought together as a result of great power contrivance. In the case of Czechoslovakia, again, very much as a result of French and British contrivance. You're supposed to link this into Belgium. And then, of course, you can bring in the example of Yugoslavia. But it's interesting, isn't it, that you can bring in the example of Switzerland. And people don't seem to have that much of an issue with Switzerland being an independent nation or not being a fake country, considering that Switzerland also has this divide between the Latin-speaking peoples, the French, and the Germanic-speaking peoples, obviously the Germans. And I have to look at Czechoslovakia and see that one of the reasons why Czechoslovakia rightly failed and was considered in many ways an artificial construct is because there is no, or was really no, historical continuity between those places, Slovakia and the Czech Republic, or what is now Czechia. Those regions were forced together purely as a result of this new sort of radical ethnic conception of what it means to be West Slavic. If you're looking for a historical parallel of these regions being foisted together, you have to look back to something like 1,300 years before the creation of Czechoslovakia. That simply does not exist when it comes to the state of Belgium. And when it comes to two areas of distinct sort of ethnic cohorts sort of existing as one state, do I need to sort of remind people that Sweden was often simply considered to be Finland and Sweden together? The distinction between Sweden and Finland in terms of its existence as a national state, a nation state, didn't really come into the fore until 1809, when it was severed as a result of the Russian annexation. In the same way that Spain is a composite identity. Spain is a composite nation that was brought together as a result of two nations forming an alliance, the crowns of Aragon and the crowns of Castile. And the crown of Aragon has a very distinct Catalan population, which of course is still causing the Spanish issues today in terms of Catalan separatism. So you can draw on all of these links, and in that sense, Belgium is not exceptional in the grand sort of scheme of these sort of combo identities, in this case it being the Flemish and the Walloons. And of course you can draw this in terms of nations of historical identity, nations of scale. You can bring in France, and you look at the relationship between the French cosmopolitan elite in Paris and compare it to the regionalism of Brittany, or the Pays d'Occitan, and these diminishing cultures in the south, etc. So all this is to say that we have many nations in Europe which don't fit neatly into this category of what essentially means to be a nation state, in the sense that one exists as a result of some sort of ethnic cohesion. But there's very much the case that Belgium has existed historically as a region, if nothing else, on and off, as a geographical expression, but more than that, as a state construct, since the earliest times of even the early sort of Merovingian period in Frankish history and the Carolingian period. And I want to get more into that. But in terms of looking beyond this conception of, oh, well, it's just Wallonia, oh, it's just Flanders smashed together as a result of this great power contrivance, I really want to get at what I believe is a trifactor identity regarding Belgium, probably at its strongest in terms of what we can conceive of as a united Belgian identity. The monarchy, one, the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, the church, being the Catholic Church, and this idea of neutrality, which actually fits into an explanation of geography. However, there are unique stresses placed on each of these factors. So, for example, when it comes to the monarchy, we have this idea of a Burgundian dynastic continuity, all the way from the figure you can see on the left on this thumbnail, which is Philip the Good, to the sovereign Netherlands, which is, we can look to figures such as Isabella Clara, the niece of Philip II of Spain in 1598. We can look to its status as a Hapsburg governorship. And we can also look to the precedent of the later monarchy, which was formulated after the revolution in 1831. And this is fascinating in terms of looking at this from the point of view of anarchical history, because Belgium begins its existence as a dynastic construct. It is a composite of many duchies and counties which are brought together by Philip the Good, here on the left. And it survives in various incarnations. It is amalgamated with territories in France and territories in the Netherlands. The territories in the Netherlands eventually break off thanks to a revolution, and the territories in France are conquered by the state of France. However, the dynastic construct basically survives. And it survives up until an argument I'm going to posit, which is that the Habsburgs effectively relinquish their control over Belgium as a dynastic construct. And yet, this sense of a united culture around this quote unquote fake nation is so strong that a revolution breaks out in 1830 around the whole basis of national self-determination. And they bring in a monarch, and it's a monarch based on this idea imported from France, which is Orleanism, which is that there isn't a king of Belgium, rather, there is a king of the Belgians. Belgium exists as a distinct entity, distinct from its king. It is not simply a dynastic extension of essentially being possessed by that king. And as a result of it, Belgium is this bizarre instance in which you have a people, a Belgian identity, a culture, which is basically receiving a king as opposed to being dominated by a king, hence the endurance of this idea of an Orleanist state. I am king of the French, I am king of the Belgians, rather than simply king of Belgium. And that is the legacy of 1830, 1831. Now we come to the Catholic Church. You can look at the Catholic Church in Belgium and you can see it as really the endurance of Catholic politics, really until the late 20th century. There was this ongoing conflict throughout the time of the 19th and the 20th centuries between liberalism and socialism. But nevertheless, Catholic politics is at the forefront of Belgian society, all the way up until I'd probably say the 1990s, when King Baudouin very famously abdicated, so he didn't have to force through the expansion of the right to abortion. But if you look at, say, for example, France across the border, France went through an aggressive process of secularization in the early 20th century as a result of many things, but you can say the catalyst was the Dreyfus affair. And they introduced something called laïcité, which effectively nationalizes the church assets and separates the Catholic Church from having any institutional role or influence within the French state. In the case of Belgium, the Belgian royalty effectively become Catholics, firm Catholics, despite beginning as Lutherans. Catholic prelates, cardinals, archbishops have very strong influence in terms of the politics, and Catholic parties, in particular the Catholic Union, survive, and Belgium becomes a Catholic bastion, first of all, to define themselves against the Dutch, and then in contrast to the Francophone tendencies of the country which borders them to the south. And then we come to this idea of neutrality. This idea of Belgium effectively being a European necessity, which is separating France and Germany, but also acts, you can say, as in the same way that Europe represents this conflict between French and Germanic cultures. That conflict is in itself represented within the Belgium national community as well. But when you look at this as a distinct territory, you can look at Belgica, look at Austrasia, which was the original sort of Carolingian Merovingian kingdom. You can look to Lotharingia, which was one of the three divisions of the Carolingian Empire. Lotharingia was basically eastern France, the Netherlands, and Wallonia. And then you come to Burgundy, which was where we can extract the whole notion of Belgian statehood from the 15th century. All this is to say that Belgium's existence is certainly a product of history. It is not a contrivance, and it's certainly not a contrivance that simply popped out of nowhere in the 1830s as a result of British intervention, as Nigel Farage would have us believe. And as a result of that, there was also remarkably, considering it began its life as a dynastic construct of these disparate peoples being held together in a composite, there is the persistence of a Belgian consciousness, and there is clearly national agency. But that is not to say that the modern state of Belgium is not in a crisis. It clearly is. Belgium has and will always exist as a result of compromise. But I believe that with the diminution of this trifactor identity, the monarchy, the church, and this historic neutrality, this being what separates the major warring powers, France, Great Britain, and Germany from one another, it has allowed instead regionalism, regional identity, that of Wallonia and that of Flanders, to come to the fore. And you can say in many ways that Belgium is a microcosm. It is a microcosm of a crisis of nationality, national identity, that is endemic to all of Europe today. And this is all the more appropriate as Belgium represents the center of the European Union. And this is another point of irony. What was originally conceived as the core, the origin point of a European empire by Charles V. He was originally Charles the Lord of Burgundy, the Lord of the Netherlands, Charles of Ghent, who then goes on to be Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, etc., etc. This empire effectively, this core point of a European empire under the Habsburgs under Charles V was ultimately, and I would say tragically, subsumed into another empire, the empire of the European Union. I don't think it's fair to say, as some people have joked, that the European Union is a Belgian empire, because if that is the case, then Belgium distinctiveness and Belgium's historic policy of neutrality has really been suffocated under the European Union. I won't make any predictions as to whether Belgium or the European Union will collapse, but even with that on the horizon, that cannot justify a retroactive, teleological understanding of history, wherein if a country is to fail, it was destined to fail, and worse was always fake. I know I mentioned that rather flippantly with Czechoslovakia, but there are definitely gradations when I say this, and Czechoslovakia is not in the same league when it comes to a country like Belgium. When it comes to this idea that you can basically say that a nation is failing, thereby it deserves to fail, I mean, I will leave you all to draw your conclusions about where the line of argumentation in that regard leaves us beyond the example of Belgium. But to start off, I was thinking how to introduce the topic of nationality and how to introduce the topic of culture. Because, of course, a nation is distinct from a country. What a nation is still basically philosophical. You can define a nation in terms of culture. You can define a nation in terms of a state operating within a certain set of boundaries. You could define a nation in terms of some form of ethnogenesis. But I found interesting going back and reading T.S. Eliot and his Notes on Towards a Definition of Culture, where he talks about unity and diversity in the region, just as a means of basically being able to introduce some of the themes recurrent in Belgium's story. A people should be neither too united nor too divided if its culture is to flourish, this T.S. Eliot. Excessive unity may be due to barbarism and may lead to tyranny. Excessive division may be due to decadence and may also lead to tyranny. Either excess will prevent further development in culture. The proper degree of unity and of diversity cannot be determined for all peoples at all times. We can only state and illustrate some departments in which excess or defect is dangerous, which is necessary, beneficial, or deleterious for a particular people at a particular time. It must be left to the wisdom of the sage and the insight of the statesman. Neither a classless society nor a society of strict and impenetrable social barriers is necessarily good. Each class should have a constant additions and defections. The classes, while remaining distinct, should all be able to mix freely, and they should all have a community of culture, with each will give something in common, more fundamental than the community which each class has its counterpart in another society. Basically, this is an argument against rigidity and the idea of subtle permutations of culture. Of the advantages of administrative and sentimental unity, we hardly need be reminded after the experience of war, but it is often assumed that the unity of wartime should be preserved in times of peace. Amongst any people engaged in warfare, especially when the war appears or can be made to appear purely defensive, we may expect a spontaneous unity of sentiment which is genuine. An affectation of it on the part of those who merely wish to escape odium, and from all submission to the commands of the constitutional authorities. We should hope to find the same harmony and docility among the survivors of a shipwreck adrift in a lifeboat. People often express regret that the same unity, self-sacrifice, and fraternity which prevail in an emergency cannot survive the emergency itself. That can certainly be an allusion to the original Belgian Revolution. And indeed, you can say the Brabant Revolution some 40 years earlier. Either we are in opposition to the overzealous reforms of Joseph II, who is hacking at the ancient estates and institutions of this region, or we can look to the example of the overweening encroachments of a despotic William of Orange, in the case of the Netherlands, King William, not the original William the Silent, and the advance of Protestantism and the overrepresentation of the North vis-a-vis the South. And you can say that we are defining ourselves in opposition to this. But nevertheless, when it comes to this idea of a nation being able to survive the idea of emergency, despite the Brabant Revolution and despite 1830, Belgium has existed for 200 years, and one simply can't account for that in terms of being a identity formed of all of these disparate constituent parts which have no commonality. But if that is the case, how could they have survived as an entity for 200 years? We must distinguish at all events between the kind of unity which is necessary in an emergency and that which is appropriate for the development of culture in a nation at peace. It is conceivable, of course, that a period of peace may be a period of preparation for war, or of a continuation of warfare in another form, in which situation we may expect a deliberate simulation of patriotic sentiment and a rigorous system of central government control. It might be expected, too, in such a period, that economic warfare would be conducted by strict government discipline, not left to the guerrillas and privateers of enterprise. But I am concerned here with the kind and degree of unity desirable in a country which is at peace with other countries, for if it cannot have periods of real peace, it is futile to hope for culture at all. The kind of unity with which I am concerned is not expressible as a common enthusiasm or a common purpose. Enthusiasms and purpose are always transient. This idea of something being able to survive unconsciously, despite, you can say, all the trials and tribulations and the individual circumstances which foster this sense of commonality and unity. The unity with which I am concerned must largely be unconscious, and therefore can perhaps be best approached through a consideration of useful diversities. It's important that a man should feel himself not to be merely a citizen of a particular nation, but a citizen of a particular part of his country, with local loyalties. These, like loyalty to a class, arise out of loyalty to a family. The problem of regionalism is seldom contemplated in its proper perspective. I introduce, T.S. Eliot, the term regionalism deliberately, because of the associations which it is apt to conjure up. It means, I think, to most people, the conception of some small group of local malcontents conducting a political agitation, which, because it is not formidable, is regarded as ludicrous, for any movement for what is assumed to be a lost cause always excites ridicule. We expect to find regionalists attempting to revive some language which is disappearing and ought to disappear, or to revive customs of a bygone age which have lost all significance, or to obstruct the inevitable and accepted progress of mechanization and large-scale industry. Even though he's clearly intimating and will go on to explicitly reference the case of Scotland and the case of Wales as perhaps being more insignificant, there are many things you can bring in here. The idea of French language essentially being an attempt to supersede the idea of Flemish or Dutch particularism, and indeed the idea of mechanization and industry is particularly appropriate in Belgium, considering it was the second country in the world to industrialize. And again, this idea of reviving customs, or basically being able to create a nation artificially. In the case of Belgium, this whole idea of Flemish regionalism, and indeed you can say Wallonian sort of regionalism to counteract that, has really sort of been gaining momentum since the 1960s in earnest. And of course, that sort of reaches its apogee when we come to the governmental crisis between, was it 2007 and 2011, where Belgium theoretically didn't have a government and simply sort of existed on as a result of autopilot. So the case of regionalism is very far advanced when it comes to the situation in Belgium. Here, T.S. Eliot goes on to introduce a new notion that is vital importance for a society of friction between its parts. Accustomed as we are to think in figures of speech taken from machinery, we assume that a society, like a machine, should be as well oiled as possible, provided with ball bearings of the best steel. We think of friction as waste of energy. I shall not attempt to substitute any other imagery. Perhaps at this point, the less we think in analogies, the better. In the last chapter, I suggested that in any society which became permanently established in either case, a caste or a classes system, the culture would decay. One might even put it that a classes society should always be emerging into class, and a class society should always be tending towards obliteration of its class distinctions. That essentially is the de facto reality of what we have in the Soviet Union. I now suggest that both class and region, by dividing the inhabitants of a country into two different kinds of groups, lead to a conflict favorable to creativeness and to progress. And these are only two of the indefinite number of conflicts and jealousies which should be profitable to society. Indeed, the more the better, so that everyone should be an ally of everyone else in some respects, and an opponent in several others, and no one conflict, envy, or fear will dominate. As individuals, we find that our development depends upon the people whom we meet in the course of our lives. The benefit of these meetings is due as much to the differences as to the resemblances, to the conflict as well as the sympathy between persons. Fortunate the man who at the right moment meets the right friend, fortunate also the man who at the right moment meets the right enemy. I do not approve the exterminations of the enemy, the policy of the extermination, or as it barbarously said, liquidation of enemies, is one of the most alarming developments of modern war and peace. From the point of view of those who desire the survival of culture, one needs the enemy. So within limits, the friction not only between individuals but between groups seems to me a quality necessary for civilization. The universality of irritation is the best assurance of peace. A country within which the divisions have gone too far is a danger to itself. A country which is too well united, whether by nature or by device, by honest purpose or by fraud and oppression, is a menace to others. So in this sense, Belgium perfectly encapsulates that sentiment, a nation which is neither too divided or a nation which is too united. This idea of this sense of constant friction and the idea that it is the jealousies in many ways combined with this idea of these intermittent national emergencies, whether it be the revolutions or whether it be the case of war, that are bringing this whole idea of an idiosyncratic regional Belgium identity together. And also, this should be noted, this is very distinct from an argument based on the idea of that diversity is our strength. No, he doesn't say that at all. This is a identity fostered around regionalism specifically. It is geographic instances of identity. It is particularisms being able to be fostered within a grand sense of the country. One has a loyalty to one's town, which is distinct necessarily from one's province, which has distinctiveness compared to one's country. And there's an interesting notion again in terms of this friction being able to necessitate the cause of civilization, in the sense that the friction is able to produce creativity and jealousies spur on competition, which allows for societies to be essentially be able to continue to generate and continue to progress, quote unquote, in certain areas, while other societies which are too self-assured, too homogenous, effectively remain stagnant and regress if you look to other countries. So nevertheless, I thought that was a very interesting way of being able to contextualize the whole Belgium experience of these jealousies, these frictions, not being too separate, not being too cohesive. And to sort of illustrate this in terms of bringing on to the topic of Belgium specifically, I have a short segment from Antoon van den Braembusche's The Silence of Belgium. I am born in Belgium. I am a Belgian. But Belgium was not born in me, writes the Flemish poet Len Nolens. There is surely some kind of uneasiness in being Belgian. And if Belgium simply does not exist, it would still be a memory. Or perhaps one should say a loss of memory, a loss of identity, an absence, a silence, a slip of the tongue. This uneasiness that comes with being Belgium stems from two long-standing problems. The first proceeds from a perception that Belgium is an artificial construction, a nation made up of at least two different peoples and always on the edge of breaking up into its linguistic communities. The linguistic conflict between the Dutch-speaking Flemish and the French-speaking Walloons has indeed divided the country ever since its creation in 1830. Emphasis on division is not necessarily fair to say that the division has been a constant feature in terms of its intensity. If you look at the course of the last 200 years, it really is a fluctuation in terms of the intensities of those divisions. The conflict has always been and continues to be a destabilizing factor in Belgian politics. The other endemic problem, not unrelated to a previous one, is related to Belgium's image as a corrupt country with a precarious policy-making tradition and an obscure arbitrary administration in which crude party politics and vested interests predominate as a rule. This in the context of Belgium historically being a unitary state. And interestingly enough, I was talking about Prussia last week, and the whole exemplar of Prussian identity was the idea that it was the exemplar of the Prussian state, not necessarily the Prussian ethno sort of cultural identity, which was what made Prussia as an idea so appealing. The idea that Prussia is a model of collective responsibility, entrenched hierarchy, many of these elements which T.S. Eliot brings in terms of this helpful idea of jealousies and frictions. But nevertheless, it was the veneration, the exemplar of Prussian statehood, which allows people to purchase into this idea of Prussiandom. When it comes to today, the idea of Belgium certainly being in decline erodes the idea of Belgium being a nation state in the traditional sense as being able to exert authority. And so the unitary state instead makes way for the arguments around federalism, which is still essentially in flux and has been an ongoing issue since the 1990s. When the Dutroux affair, which is a case of a Belgian serial killer, became widely known, the international press characterized Belgium as one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. The resignation of Willy Clay as Secretary General of NATO because of the Augusta scandal, and the recent revelations of massive fraud in the well-known Lenhout and Hospy company have only reinforced that perception. This article, by the way, was written about a decade ago. But Belgium is an ambiguous country. The uneasiness is matched by a certain pride, which cuts across the linguistic division and even transcends the corrupt image to a large extent. In French, the word Belgitude refers not only to the fact of being Belgian, but to the fact of feeling at home in Belgium. Belgitude stands for a unique lifestyle, a Burgundian way of life, in which the enjoyment of food and drink makes life a real pleasure. And in a much larger sense still, Belgitude stands for a kind of conviviality and coziness that is quite unique and unquestionably makes Belgium an attractive country, not only for tourists, but also for refugees as well. The emphasis on the implications of that today. Indeed, if we look at Belgitude, you can see it as essentially a equivalent. I brought in the example of Belgium being a smaller version of Austria-Hungary at the beginning, and then combined to this idea of Belgitude, you come up with this idea that I actually referenced in a recent video, this idea of coziness, enjoyment, a passive sort of acceptable way of life. And in Austria, this is replicated as the idea of Gemütlichkeit. And its endemic mismanagement notwithstanding, one should not forget that Belgium is a true welfare state with public health legislation that no doubt ranks among the best in the world. So in spite of the linguistic conflict, in spite and maybe to a certain extent because of the corrupt administration, life is comparatively easy and rewarding in Belgium. Yet there is more that could be said about Belgian pride in relating to a question of Belgian identity. On a cultural level, just give me a second. There. On a cultural level, there undeniably exists a Belgian imaginary, as in imaginary as an identity which supersedes mere politics and realities into the realm of sort of Platonic forms and art, characterized by a unique blend of realism and magic. This characteristic can be found not only in Flemish painting, as in the work of Peter Brugger de Elders, or even Hieronymus Bosch, a Dutch painter influenced by the Flemish primitives, but also in the symbolist writings of Emile Verhaeren, Maurice Maeterlinck, and Georges Rodenbach, and J.K. Huysmans. One sees this same unique blend of realism and magic at work in Belgian comic strips and surrealist paintings, especially in the works of Hergé and René Magritte, two world-famous Belgian icons. Additionally, one of the most telling currents to emerge in Flemish literature after World War II was the so-called magic realism, represented most fully by the novels of Johan Dietz and Hubert Lampeau. In the magical realism, one also meets a dark side of the Belgian identity, a kind of metaphysical and sublime death, an abyss that seems to underlie the daily devotion to conviviality and sociability. One can find a striking representation of the inner tensions of Belgian identity in one painting, Confrontière l'Hébergie, a glass-fronted wooden box with mixed media by a Tanzanian artist, Evelyn Nicodemus, which has been living in Belgium for a number of years. Here, the above mentioned Burgundian delight and metaphysical abyss are embodied in fragments of Hieronymus Bosch's well-known Garden of Earthly Delights. Additionally, the dark side of Belgian politics, confronted, as it were, by a steady possibility of linguistic division and with an apocalyptic vision of central state and a fortiori of the monarchy, it is represented in two identical statues, Mannequin P, that are standing with their backs to each other. Here, the light-hearted culture and tourist symbols of Brussels are used satirically to underscore the centrifugal forces of the nation, The use of glass under the box, and particularly the grid-like structure that is so typical in Nicodemus's work, ties together a conceptual vision, both the fragmentary and the ambiguous. The possible abyss is not far away, but it is counterbalanced by the marvelous pictorial synthesis of the work. In any event, this potential abyss has always threatened the unifying myth behind Belgium's official motto, L'union fait la force, unity creates strength, and which has been most effective in times of war. Indeed, it has been above all times of war, where the very existence of the Belgian nation was at stake, that the Flemish and Walloon communities were able to mobilize and thus become united against a common enemy. The unifying myth was then most appealing, but at the same time most fragile. A case in point to the so-called royal question, which took place shortly after World War II, and was without doubt the most severe crisis ever faced by the Belgian monarchy. Anti-Unitarian forces, especially on the Walloon side, rejected King Leopold III because of his alleged collaboration with the German Nazis. The whole nation was in a state of upheaval. Leopold III, who had already been replaced by Prince Charles as regent, and was soon replaced by the young Baudouin, the sad king, who managed to restore the popularity of the royal house. The challenge of unifying the centrifugal forces of a divided nation and of reconciling thoroughly contradictory interests tells us something important about Belgian political identity. The centrifugal forces are indeed multiple: Flemish versus Walloon interests, federal against Unitarian tendencies, capitalist against socialist pressures, Catholic against humanist convictions, humanist always going back to the example of the original humanists, so for example Erasmus, indigenous against immigrants, and so on. Because of these centrifugal forces, Belgium has and always will remain a nation in search of itself. Its political identity has always been, in the sense, in the making, in constant adaptation and adjustment to the necessities of the moment. In this respect, Belgian politics has shown a remarkable flexibility, exemplifying an unusual ability to balance conflicting and even incompatible interests, with a rule which, as a rule, lead to ingenious compromises. Prime ministers such as Wilfred Martens and Jean-Luc Dehaene proved to be masters in compromise and would not have been able to rule the country otherwise. The Belgian notion of compromise is quite famous, though it has the negative flavour of clumsy texts that are difficult to disentangle and that are open to the more diverse and even conflicting interpretations. It has also been considered a prolific model for the ongoing European process of unification, in particular the whole Belgian process of federalization, in which the autonomy of three linguistic communities, the French, the Dutch, and the Germans, and the special status of the Brussels region, had to be reconciled with the autonomy of the central state apparatus. It is widely considered as a kind of exemplary test case for the challenges facing Europe. It is a symbolic role model of Belgian politics that is strengthened by the central location of Brussels, which is frequently called the capital of Europe. In terms of that, I'm going to bring it back and really actually explain how, in many ways, I think that actually dooms the Belgian identity. However, in a sense, it also makes Belgium relevant. And you can say also it's this dark implication as well that it has become an inseparable aspect of the project of the European Economic Community and now the European Union. But where does Belgium come from in terms of really providing some sort of historical background to this? Well, I mentioned the idea of Austrasia, the original Frankish, Merovingian, later Carolingian state, and you can see it on this image on the left here, which as a core is bounded by the rivers Rhine, it's bounded by the river Somme in the southwest, it intersects the river Main, which forms into the area of Franconia. It also covers most of the area of Lorraine and a large section of Frisia, now the Netherlands, albeit that territory was actually virtually uninhabitable in those days, given it is called the Low Countries for obvious reasons. And as you can see on the right map, this mutates into a European state which is later amalgamated into the Holy Roman Empire called Lotharingia. Just a thing I want people to remember and note in terms of the idiosyncrasies of Belgian identity. The map on the center, as you can see, Flanders, Flemish Flanders, is part of France, and French-speaking Wallonia and Lorraine and much of eastern France were part of the Holy Roman Empire. So in other words, Flanders began its career as a French county, whilst Wallonia was part of the German-dominated Holy Roman Empire. So it's not simply fair to say that one should belong to France and one should belong to Belgium. If you're looking at an example of historical precedent, Flanders has a much longer history of belonging to France than Wallonia, French-speaking Wallonia, ever has. If you're looking to some sort of precedent for this, this is around the 9th century. So we're looking at 600 years of Flanders still being technically considered part of the medieval kingdom of France. In that sense, you can say that had Flanders been able to subsist as part of France, it could be similar to, say, for example, the distinctiveness of Brittany, even though Brittany was a very late addition to France in that respect. Ultimately, you can say correctly that Flanders, historically, has been part of France for longer than Brittany has, and yet Wallonia, historically, has only been part of France when it comes to examples like the First French Empire. Very intermittently, we're talking about a period of decades as opposed to a period of centuries. But at the end of the 14th century, one man comes along, John the Fearless, and he unites the regions of Flanders and unites the regions of Burgundy together. And that really is the basis of the Burgundian dukes, who are members of the French royal family, the House of Valois, expanding as a result of marriage policies and military conquests into the Netherlands. It's under the reign of Philip the Good. Philip the Good, who also is, by the way, responsible for stimulating, patronizing the Flemish Renaissance, which later gives way to the whole idea of European humanism. He creates the Order of the Golden Fleece. In fact, the Burgundian style of music and dress is so endemic that effectively it becomes the Burgundian style. It is Burgundy that is spawning all of these trends, which are going to be replicated throughout all of Europe. Indeed, when you look at the great artistic innovations of, say, for example, Maximilian, the Emperor of Austria, he is very much imitating Burgundian styles. Burgundy was the cultural center of Europe, and it was centered on cities in Belgium, such as Brussels, such as Ghent, and such as Brugge and Mechelen and Antwerp. There is a vibrant economy here, and yet is a dynastic construction. All of these elements, like I said, they cross the Holy Roman Empire and they cross into the borders of France. Philip the Good basically gobbles up these territories you can see on the right hand of the map, which is predominantly these territories you can see here as pertains to Belgium: Luxembourg, the County of Flanders, and the Duchy of Brabant. The one territory which is now part of Belgium, which doesn't feature in this, is a territory which cuts right through it, which is the bishopric of Liège. But this is partly because many of the Burgundian royal dukes were basically able to put a relative on the throne of Liège and on the bishop's seat of Liège and control it indirectly. Because it was a bishopric, because it wasn't secularized, it couldn't simply be conquered in an era before the mediatizations, just to clear that up. So that is the origin in terms of how we can define Belgium as a geographic expression. Indeed, it goes on from there, from being a composite monarchy as par excellence, or what we later see with the Habsburgs. Charles the Bold attempts to unite this into a kingdom. He dies. It's inherited by his daughter, who then marries a Habsburg, who then produces the dynasty that spawns Charles V. Charles V is the great grandson of Philip the Good. And as a result of that, because he is born in Burgundy, because he's raised in Ghent, because his grandmother was Mary of Burgundy, because he is not Holy Roman Emperor, his grandfather is still alive, he is essentially of Burgundy, of Belgium, so as we can speak of it, of the Netherlands, before he is king of Spain and before he is king of before he is emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And this whole idea of the composite monarchy is going to be replicated in the Habsburg formula with Spain and the crowns of Castile and Aragon, as I mentioned. And then we go over to Austria, and then we look at this composite identity of all of the little Austrian duchies, archduchies, combined with the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Duchy of Moravia, and of course the kingdoms of Hungary, Croatia, etc., etc. All this is to say that Belgium, composite identity, is one of many of these Habsburg realms, and that is where we see the origins of this defined territory evolving out of it. And indeed, you can say as a result of that, there is a distinct political system which is bound, you can say, by a precursor of the federalism that we see in later sort of Belgian politics today. But it is not federalism simply based on the idea of ethnicity. Rather, it's a composite identity based on the particularisms of these individual counties and duchies, etc. It is a very medievalistic conception of what it means effectively to assert autonomy in this whole area. But as of course you know, and as you can see on this map, the Belgian identity was synonymous with the Dutch identity. Indeed, Belgium is the Latin rendering of the Netherlands, which is the Germanic rendering of this territory. And in the French, of course, it is Pays de Bas, it is simply the Low Countries, to combine these sort of linguistic references. Belgium retains its identity essentially as the Latin description, and this goes all the way back to the whole idea of Belgica. So it is not simply something which is invented post hoc as a result of these sort of neoclassical affectations in the 1830s. Rather, Belgium is part of the official nomenclature of the church and of the state, going all the way back to the 15th century when these territories were being united under Philip the Good. And of course, you have to understand that in this period, Latin is the mainstay in terms of language. Later, it will be French. The whole idea of the sort of equality of these sort of linguistic divisions is a nonsense, really, to speak of this. And really, that only comes to the fore later in the 19th century. So all of these things to consider. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that I was in part motivated to talk about this because it brings up a conversation about what the Habsburgs were doing in this territory. And this is effectively my opportunity to explore that topic. Indeed, it has a rather unique political system within the grand scheme of the Habsburg monarchies. Invariably, it is actually a region dominated by Habsburg women. As I mentioned, the progenitor of the House of Burgundy in terms of it becoming part of the Habsburgs was Mary of Burgundy, the daughter of Charles the Bold, who died in his efforts to try and unite these two territories into a cohesive kingdom, a kingdom of Burgundy, effectively, which would have united the Low Countries and eastern France and parts of the original sort of core of sort of central France in Burgundy. Mary of Burgundy sets this example of women being dominant, dynastic women of the dynasty of the House of Burgundy or the House of Habsburg being dominant in here. We have Mary of Austria, who is the governor just before the Dutch revolt breaks out in the 1560s. And then we come to figures such as Isabella Clara. So this is a segment from Martyn Rady, but Martyn Rady is very much viewing this from the topic of this exceptionalism in the case of the Spanish Netherlands, the Belgica Austriacum, or Belgica Regia, as you can see, in terms of all the sort of nomenclature which is ascribed to this region, looking in terms of the predominance of women and dominating this region. Habsburg rulers made their womenfolk regents and governors. As in much else, Maximilian I had led the pace, appointing in 1507 his widowed daughter to rule Burgundy and the Low Countries in his stead. Maximilian, of course, was the grandfather of Charles V and the husband of Mary of Burgundy. But the Spanish connection mattered too, for in Aragon and Castile, women faced few impediments, being accepted in both kingdoms as rulers and as equal heirs to division of property. Right through to the 18th century, high-born Spanish women sat cross-legged on the floor, but this did not stop them from mounting the highest offices. Back in the 16th century, Emperor Charles V had employed his glamorous wife Isabella of Portugal to rule in Spain. The last of the Habsburg Spanish line, Charles II, the Bewitched, had as his regent and curator his widowed mother, Mariana of Austria, whose ruthless manipulation of the young king was matched only by her political incompetence. The Low Countries were always supposed to be governed by members of the ruling House of Habsburg, but there were insufficient legitimate men to fulfill this role, hence the recruitment of the bastard Don Juan. Women stepped into the breach. For more than half of the 16th century, the governors were female. Margaret of Austria, Mary of Hungary, Margaret of Parma, who was both a bastard and a woman. In 1598, Philip II ceded outright the government of the Spanish Low Countries to his daughter Isabella Clara and her husband Albert, who was Philip's nephew several times over. Throughout her marriage, Isabella referred to Albert as mon cousin. This year, as you can see this image on the left of Isabella Clara, the year of 1598 is a remarkable precedent, you can say, in terms of the autonomy of Belgium. Belgium, as you can see, roughly approximating this territory here, which is actually smaller because this area used to have a large segment of France as well. The Dutch revolt occurs in the 1560s. The Dutch effectively formed their separatist movement from 1579, and this during the course of something called the 80 Years' War. But this is to say that the county of Holland and Frisia and Utrecht and Gelders, all of these territories in the north of the original Burgundian Habsburg Netherlands, have defected. But this core, this Catholic core, remains. And it is in 1598 that Philip II decides to recognize this as an independent sovereign territory, an independent kingdom in and of itself. And the reason it fails is because Isabella Clara doesn't have any children. Had she been able to produce children, it is very possible that Belgium could have assumed its role as a kingdom as early as the 17th century, albeit in alliance with the Habsburgs. Basically, you can see it as part of a tripartite alliance with the Austrian Habsburgs, the Spanish Habsburgs, and the Belgian, or more appropriately, perhaps the Burgundian Habsburgs. But this is again all to say that if we look at the historical precedents for Belgian identity and compare it to something like Czechoslovak identity, the example in terms of that exact territory, more or less, excluding the bishopric of Liège, having an independent sovereign and being seen as a political entity, as a nation state, goes all the way back to the 16th century, which I have to remind you is older than most European countries that we see in especially Central and Eastern Europe, including Germany and Italy, it should be mentioned, which only became countries in the 1860s and 1870s. Philip intended that Albert and Isabella's descendants should rule the Low Countries as sovereign dukes, but as their union was barren, this didn't happen. On Albert's death in 1621, Isabella removed her parrots and dwarves from the palace in Brussels, cut her hair, and assumed the habit and veil of a nun. Even so, she continued to rule, but no longer as a sovereign archduchess, being now merely governor on behalf of Philip IV of Spain until her own death in 1633. Thereafter, the governorship of the Low Countries alternated between male relatives of the Spanish king, and in the absence of these, Castilian and Portuguese grandees. Just a note on the cities. The perceived capital of the lordship of the Netherlands under Charles the Bald, who died in 1477, was Mechelen, which is a city between, or rather a town now, between Antwerp and Brussels. Indeed, it was there that Charles the Bald effectively tried to create a form of an Estates General, a Conseil de Roi, a Council of the King, attempting to take all of these composite elements, all of the estates, and amalgamate them into one territory. Yes, this would have included large parts of France and the United Netherlands, but I mentioned the example of 1598. This is all to say again that the precedent had begun much earlier, and this pertains to the capital cities as well. So it is during the reign of Charles V that Brussels, especially now that Antwerp basically has been dispossessed of its economic sort of importance thanks to the Dutch revolt and the prevalence of cities such as Rotterdam and Amsterdam, that Brussels becomes the center of a political entity which is going to form into Belgium. The Spanish Low Countries comprise 10 provinces, which are roughly where Belgium and Luxembourg are today, except they were split down the middle by the independent bishopric of Liège. Independent very much in quotes, because like I said, this is a result of the unique political system within the Holy Roman Empire, which gave bishoprics basically temporal power. And this also meant that, like I said, Liège was often dominated by a relative controlling that, or an ally controlling those territories, in order to make them de facto continuous. Each province had its own particular rights, liberties, privileges, customs, and usages that the incoming governor was sworn to uphold. Only in Brabant were these formally codified, which gave leeway to the governors to develop their own interpretations. And you can say in many ways this actually necessitates the idea of a Belgian monarchy before the formal creation of a Belgian monarchy in 1831, because it's the figure of the governor or it's the figure of the monarch who is able basically to bridge the gaps in terms of all these disparate uncodified constitutions and manage the relationships of the estates. Even so, the principle that taxation required the consent of representatives of the communities on which it was laid was never effaced, imposing considerable limits on the governor's power. The Spanish Low Countries synthesized Flemish and Spanish culture. Spanish plays were frequently performed in the cities, both in the original and in the translation. There were 19 translations into Flemish of Lope de Vega's dramas alone. Spanish patrons, not less the king himself, brought the works of Flemish artists, while Albert and Isabella commissioned pieces by Rubens, both for the Koutenberg Palace in Brussels and for churches in Spain. Typically, these conveyed a religious content that rehashed the main themes of Hapsburg piety, veneration for the Eucharist, and the cult of the Virgin Mary. More down-to-earth exchanges saw over 100 Flemish women marry Spanish soldiers of the Antwerp garrison in a single decade of 1638 to 1647. Even the Flemish language began to pick up a few Spanish speakers. Religion was the cement. The dissolution of the Low Countries in the late 16th century into a Protestant North and a Catholic South was accompanied by a massive refugee movement, with as many as 150,000 people fleeing to the 10 southern provinces that remained under Spanish rule. The Spanish Low Countries adopted the substance and display of Baroque Catholicism, with the densest concentration of wayside chapels, shrines, and calvaries anywhere in Europe. The religious orders, and in particular the Jesuits, not only completed the work of conversion, but also instilled a deep religiosity. By the 1640s, the Jesuit Flemish-Belgian province numbered almost 900 Jesuit priests, 8 for every 10,000 inhabitants, as opposed to 5 in Spain and just 1 in France. Seminaries churned out clergy, not for domestic labor, but also to feed Jesuit missions in Latin America, Angola, and China. The War of the Spanish Succession saw the Spanish Low Countries overrun by France and then briefly occupied by British and Dutch forces. Before being assigned by treaty to Charles VI in 1714, the Treaty of Rastatt obliged Charles to maintain the provinces of the now Austrian Low Countries in their liberties. The Marquis de Prie, a corrupt Sardinian in Charles's service, took the oaths on his master's behalf in a grand ceremony, for which he displayed canvases showing the emperor's victories, and in place of the usual city militias, ostentatiously mustered companies of fusiliers and grenadiers. But each inauguration was preceded by haggling with the provincial parliaments that limited the real power of Habsburg government. Even the cost of the celebratory fireworks needed negotiation. Despite Charles VI's display of military might, the Austrian Low Countries had to be run as conceptually as under Spanish rule. That had been one of the core elements for the original Dutch revolt, the idea that Philip II of Spain wanted to impose a military government across the entirety of the Netherlands, and under Don Juan, he nearly achieves this, and under the Duke of Parma. However, as part of this settlement, the Spanish have won in the sense that it remains Catholic, but this whole idea of the composite identity of the distinctiveness between all of these regions has to be adhered to by the dynasts, the Habsburg dynasts. But there's something which Rady doesn't mention, which I want to bring up here, which is the image you can see on the center, which is Maximilian Emanuel. He was actually the Duke of Bavaria. So why is he featured here? Because he was also the governor of the Netherlands, in addition to being Duke of Bavaria. He was governor of the Netherlands, in fact, for around 15 years, even though this says 23 years, because technically he was. But what I found fascinating about Maximilian Emanuel, in holding together Belgium and in holding together the Netherlands, there is some weak continuity with what we see with the Bavarian War of Succession, where the new Duke of Bavaria wants to exchange Bavaria for the Netherlands. But there's another element here, which is Maximilian Emanuel was basically his own man. He was nominally allied to Charles II, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, but he had his own ambitions. He saw his role as Duke of Bavaria and as the governor of the Spanish Netherlands, or as the Belgian state, or Burgundy, as his own launchpad, basically, to expand his ambitions into Spain itself. So under Maximilian Emanuel, who was this transitional figure between the Spanish Belgium, the Spanish Netherlands, and the Austrian Netherlands, the Belgium Austriacum, this is a man who was trying to use this state basically as his own vehicle to aggrandize and achieve power, effectively. So you can say in many ways he represented a unique sense of Belgian foreign policy as distinct from Austria and indeed as distinct from Spain. And he allied with France, he chose the wrong side, he was deposed, his Duchy of Bavaria was overrun, and the territory was ultimately reverted back to the Habsburgs under Charles VI. Like their Spanish predecessors, Charles VI and Mary Theresa used their relatives, including the women, to act as governors. For 30 of the 80 years of Austrian rule, archduchesses fulfilled this role. To this, we should add 20 years in which Mary Theresa's sister-in-law, Anne Charlotte, lay abbess of St. Waltrude's in Mons, held office as Madame Royale to her brother, the long-serving governor, Prince Charles Alexander of Lorraine. Reforming and yet sensitive to the fractious politics of the Low Countries, successive female rulers pursued largely independent policies, and they frequently blocked the plenipotentiaries appointed by Vienna to maintain imperial oversight. Neither Charles VI nor Mary Theresa wished, however, to antagonize the governors or to upset the political status quo. The Austrian Low Countries more than paid their way and also contributed to a secret fund that brought the election of Mary Theresa's son, Maximilian Francis, an elector's position in Cologne. Austrian rule fostered trade and industry. By developing roads and canals to ease international commerce, customs income doubled. Supported by his abbess sister, Charles Alexander of Lorraine sponsored the newly funded Academy of Sciences, oversaw the extension of a Louvian dial canal, and promoted some of the earliest research into electricity, air pressure, and thermodynamics. Like his brother, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, Charles Alexander was a Freemason. He was also a prolific womanizer who shared a mistress with Casanova. His surviving code of gestures recalls the nods and winks by which courtesans might be entitled to intimacy in a theatre, adjusting the neckpiece signifying a willingness to meet in private, taking a peck of snuff being an invitation to his box, and so forth. Despite the improvements in the economy of the Austrian Low Countries, it remained largely agricultural. And to Joseph II's subsequent displeasure, landowning nobles continued to dominate many of the provincial estates and urban councils. In religion, too, the Austrian Low Countries resembled a museum. The Catholic Enlightenment sought to reconcile Catholicism with scientific inquiry, to support rules in business of eliminating clerical abuses, and to inspire souls to godliness through personal devotion rather than collective rituals. The female rulers of the Austrian Low Countries would have nothing to do with it. The Archduchess Maria Elizabeth cracked down in the 1730s on the spread of Jansenism, which taught that salvation depended entirely on God's grace and was granted only to a few, and which advocated a simpler religion shorn of ceremonial trappings. Jansenism, just so it happens, I've actually talked about Jansenism elsewhere on YouTube. You can probably find the conversation. It's not that straightforward. Basically, the interpretation of Jansenism there is effectively that it's Calvinism. Yes, there are elements of crypto-Calvinism, but specifically it comes this idea of grace being irresistible and this idea of venal sin prohibiting one from taking the host and things like that. Is quite complicated, but this is all to say that there is a trend, effectively, of Catholic heterodoxy that exists within the Netherlands as well in the form of Jansenism, which then makes a very strong impression in areas of France. Charles VI recommended that the Archduchess proceed cautiously, but she allowed the archsect and the arrest of Jansenist clergy. She also refused the Emperor's request to abolish the right of asylum in churches, despite its abuse by military deserters. A particular target of the Catholic Enlightenment was the Jesuits, who were thought too dogmatic in their theology, and this in the context of the suppression of the Jesuits all throughout Europe, beginning in Portugal. But in the Austrian Low Countries, Charles Alexander and his sister resisted calls to diminish their influence and take the training of the priests out of their hands. Both also kept their Jesuit confessors. The censorship of religious materials and of Jansenist works was extended in the Austrian Low Countries, even as it was beginning to be relaxed in Vienna. The monasteries also retained their luxuries, free of Jansenist austerity. To commemorate the passing of their abbot, the monks of St. Peter's in Ghent supped as late as 1789 on a selection of meat and fish, including sturgeon, a dessert of pineapples, melons, and pears, followed by coffees and liqueurs, and finished off with oysters. It should also be mentioned, just for the sake of sort of the cultural influence. It's during this time that we see the proliferation of Belgian chocolate as well, which again is thanks to, first of all, the connection with Spain and the import of chocolate from Mesoamerica. And then, of course, that's refined under the burgeoning economy of the Austrian Belgium. Charles Alexander's saintly sister, Anne Charlotte, died in 1773, after which her brother was able to install his mistress as his consort and to continue his affair free from reproach. Like most high-born libertines, Charles Alexander was genuinely popular. Even the usual tight-fisted provincial parliaments voted a bronze statue in his honour, after the unveiling of which he presided a dress of himself as a Roman emperor. The prince's diary survives, which describes lazy days given over to long lunches, hunting, popular theatre, and losing at cards. When Charles Alexander died in 1780, with his passing, the whirlwind that was Joseph II tore the sleepy Austrian Low Countries apart. Maria Christiana was Empress Mary Theresa's favourite daughter, born on her name day. The young Mimi had, in the image you can see on the right, in the early 1760s, an intense relationship with Joseph II's first wife, Isabella of Parma. She may not have understood it to be sexual, but her letters to Isabella were unequivocal in respect to their physical relations. To keep Mimi close, Mary Theresa appointed Albert her regent in Hungary. For 15 years, Albert diligently ran Hungary from the capital at Bratislava, which was then called Pressburg, which was only 2 days' ride from Vienna. Albert's affection for his wife was matched only by his commitment to Freemasonry. On Mimi's death in 1798, he would combine his two loves in a marble tomb of dazzling eccentricity in the Augustinian church in Vienna. This being Albert of Saxony, who was the husband of Mimi. Sculpted by Canova, it shows mourners descending in through a gateway cut into a side of a Masonic pyramid. In place of the Eye of Providence, however, there is a rondel bearing Mimi's head in profile. The mausoleum is all the more shocking for its lack of Christian symbolism. In 1780, Joseph II appointed Albert and Mimi as joint governors of the Austrian Low Countries, but also installed one Count Belgiojoso as minister plenipotentiary, with the instruction that he execute Joseph's plans for the comprehensive reform of church and government. The role of the governors was thus reduced to the decorative. In any case, Joseph had shortly before their arrival in the Low Countries undertaken his own tour there. He had travelled without ceremony, staying in hotels, but had made time to hear petitions, interrogate officials, and order the panels of Adam and Eve on Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece to be removed because of their nudity. Although his visit was for less than 2 months, Joseph was convinced of the wisdom of his observations, and he had little time for Albert and Mimi's advice. As he explained pointedly to them, ministers were chosen for their talents and suitability, but the only qualification for the governors was that they were princes and princesses. Joseph pushed through the same church reforms he had elsewhere, instructing toleration and civil marriage, closing 160 religious houses, forbidding most religious festivals, and centralizing the education of priests at a single seminary. As head of the new seminary, Joseph appointed the uncompromising Jansenist Ferdinand Sturger, whose research into early church history had led him to reject most of Catholic theology. The students refused to register at the seminary, demonstrated on the streets, and hanged Sturger in effigy. They were dispersed by troops ordered in by Belgian. Unperturbed, Joseph went on in 1787 to abolish the historic provinces, appoint intendants to administer the 9 districts that replaced them, and eliminate as unnecessary many of the local courts of justice. In the case of intendants, again, this is directly imitating what you see as the centralizing efforts in France. Joseph's reforms threatened virtually every institution and section of society. Rumours of tax rises and of conscription did the rest. On the 30th of May 1787, a mob invaded the centre of Brussels amid reports of murder and plunder. Appearing in the middle of night on a balcony overlooking the main square, Albert and Mimi stilled the crowd by promising to withdraw all of Joseph's edicts. The rioters dispersed, church bells were rung, and the next day the 2 governors received a rapturous welcome, and they were toured the city in carriage. The Chamberlain in Brussels was convinced that Mimi's clear-headedness had saved the day, but she was rightly apprehensive. God forfend, she wrote in a diary, that the affectations shown to us will not come to be our undoing. affection shown to us will not come to be our undoing. Joseph's ministers praised the governor's action, but Joseph roundly condemned it as incomprehensible surrender. He made few concessions, including the dismissal of Belgiasoro, but then resumed most of his previous measures and began mustering troops. To the general on the spot in the Austrian Low Countries, he wrote that there was no need to be afraid of setting an example of terror, and you should never threaten without acting, and still less you should shoot over their heads or fire blanks. But the troops that Joseph intended to deploy had to be withdrawn to fight the Turks at the other end of Europe, leaving the Low Countries dangerously exposed. The revolution so far, a largely conservative one that aimed to restore the religious and political status quo, had become radicalized. Increasingly inspired by events across the border in France, democratic politicians advanced a program of social reform that went far beyond even Joseph's imaginings. Conservative and radical revolutions fused in 1789, the revolution, by the way, in France taking place in the same year. Just interesting to consider 1789, 1790, Brabant Revolution, 1830 revolution in France, the July Revolution, 1830 revolution in Belgium, how the old adage that when France sneezes, Europe catches cold, but in the case of Belgium, obviously with the proximity being most severe. Early the next year, representatives of the provinces proclaimed the United States of Belgium, which was the first time the name of Belgium had been used in any official way. Indeed, there is an example of this essentially being the origin point of a distinctive Belgianness. But as you can see, Joseph II's reform received such condemnation and opposition because there already existed a distinct sense of cultural identity and vested political interests and a history of autonomy that was already well in evidence and strong enough basically to be able to resist and ultimately defeat many of the reforms of Joseph II, even though his brother Leopold II brings in the army and is able to defeat them, he nevertheless rescinds virtually all of the reforms brought in by Joseph II. But this speaks to something, I think, far more substantial in terms of being able to conceptualize what Belgium is. Because bear in mind that up until now, what we're talking about, re-Belgium, from the first sort of 400 years of its history, Belgium is a dynastic state. Belgium is not a country in the modern sense, but Belgium has autonomy, and it basically has de facto independence in the sense that many governors are, by their own rights, princes of Europe, princes of the House of Hapsburg, archduchesses, queens, etc. And they have an immense purview. And when this is invaded, in the case of Joseph II, it has disastrous implications. So in the grand scheme of looking at European nationality in countries, so much as they exist at all, in the late 18th century, Belgium is at least an advanced case of autonomy and has a dynastic cohesion and identity distinct from all of its neighbors. But the reason I bring this up is because we're talking about Belgium being a dynastic construct. It's not artificial now in the sense that all of these regions were basically forced together willy-nilly. But like I said, this is now as a result of the process of a historical cohesion which has existed since the time of Philip the Good and has survived the revolutions in the Netherlands, the Protestant revolutions. It has survived the invasions of Louis XIV, something I haven't mentioned, but something that's really important. Again, you would have thought Louis XIV invading, trying to take over this territory, expanding to the east, to the left bank of the Rhine. You would have thought that many of the French territories will willingly surrender and hand themselves over to France. No. The Spanish Netherlands, later the Belgicum Austriacum, survive. This territory survives despite, in many cases, being overrun by France. You have this case where Belgium is in many ways the battleground of Europe. That's why, say, for example, Mary Theresa was willing to exchange the territory. But invariably, once the region is no longer occupied, the region reverts back to this distinctive sense of a Belgian sort of primordial culture. And that's something that really can't be stated enough. This idea that it doesn't matter how many wars are fought, no matter how many occupations occur, for some reason, it always resets to Belgium, whether it be occupation during the Spanish War of Succession, whether it be occupation during the Austrian War of Succession, whether it be occupation by the French under Napoleon, whether it be occupation by the Germans during World War One, it always, for some reason, despite apparently being a nation that does not exist, it manages always to revert back to being Belgium. Yes, you have all of these divisions, but there has to be something far more substantive in order to understand how this territory is able to continually emerge despite all of these military disasters. And obviously, I use the quote in the form of T.S. Eliot specifically because the example of T.S. Eliot specifically, because brings in this idea of a unity formed in opposition to a conquering power. And yet you're able to have this territory exist within times of peace as well. And say, for example, there are popular rulers in the form of Charles Alexander, and there are unpopular rulers in the form of someone like Joseph II. So I talk about this idea of being a dynastic state, and in the case of the 18th century, this isn't surprising. If you look at the Holy Roman Empire, virtually every state in the Holy Roman Empire is a dynastic empire. If it's not a dynastic empire, it's a bishopric, or it's a free city, or it's a domain of an imperial knight, what have you. But if you look at Prussia, which is a large sort of German population combined with a large Polish identity in the east. If you look at Austria or the Habsburg monarchy, which is a combination of Bohemian Czechs and now Poles living in Galicia, Lodomeria, Croats, Slovaks, Transylvanians, etc., etc. Belgium isn't really an exception in this case. Rather, Belgium forms the rule. It's anachronistic in terms of how we consider modern nations formed in terms of ethnogenesis, but in terms of the 18th century, it's the rule. But then something remarkable happens. You would have thought that dynasty would be the only thing holding this territory together. And yet I mentioned the idea of military occupation and it being a dynastic entity, and yet it is able to survive being renounced by the dynasty that created it, the House of Burgundy come the House of Habsburg. Because for 35 years, the Habsburgs effectively renounced Belgium. I've already mentioned the example of Joseph II. Joseph II was trying to impose a uniform and ultimately German-speaking administration throughout the course of his empire. But to make matters worse for Habsburg Belgium, he had basically tried to exchange that territory for Bavaria, believing that German Bavaria would be able to increase the German character of the Austrian Empire and also his influence within the Holy Roman Empire. So the idea is that Karl Theodore, the Elector of the Palatinate, will receive the Netherlands in exchange for Joseph II receiving Bavaria. As you can see, a peripheral consideration, a liability. Mary Theresa also thought this in terms of being able to induce France to fight on her behalf in terms of the exchange of territory. Austria returns the province of Silesia, and Belgium is basically able to give into France. And yet, for some reason, Belgium continues in its alliance with the House of Habsburg. But Joseph II does everything to alienate all of the estates of Belgium. And yet, it's only as a result of French conquest that the region is effectively lost to the Habsburgs. Then follows 20 years of occupation by France and 15 years of occupation by the Dutch. And it's during this time that what was a dynastic identity, the dynastic conception of the Belgium Austriacum, based on the House of Burgundy, based on the House of Habsburg, had effectively been renounced by the Habsburgs. Like I said, Joseph II was more than willing to dispense with it if he believed he can get a better territory out of it. In the form of that, he believed it was Bavaria. In the form of Francis II and First, the Emperor of Austria and the Holy Roman Emperor, he renounced the territory in 1797. The area had been conquered by the French in 1794, but he formally relinquishes it in 1797. He then has the chance, with the 8 Articles of London in 1814, to have the area returned to him. In fact, when Napoleon has been defeated all across Europe and the coalition armies overrun Belgium, the assumption is that it will be a provisional administration given back to the Habsburgs. Instead, it is a conscious decision by the Habsburgs, by Emperor Francis, to renounce the control of this territory. It is a dynastic possession which the dynasty which basically created it has no interest in sustaining it, which is all the more remarkable. So you would have thought, okay, it's a dynastic construct. If it's a nation, basically it's a nation that exists like Austria-Hungary. It's only there because of the unifying figure of the emperor or the duke or whatever. And so that should really end Belgium. The fact that the Emperor of Austria, Francis II and First, was prepared to renounce Belgium and give it over to the Dutch in the form of the Protestant King William. And yet, what happens in 1830? The Belgians revolt for a multitude of reasons, but the most salient reasons are the overweening authority of the king of the Netherlands, the fact that it was nominally a constitutional monarchy, but in reality the king had most of the power, and the fact that if there were parliamentary and representative institutions, the North was overrepresented, and the fact that this was a Protestant government dominating over the Catholic populations in the South. As mentioned in the Martyn Rady chapter, Belgium is Catholic in the same sense that the Netherlands is Protestant. That effectively is the form sort of demarcation point, and would help explain why the Flemish populations who are Dutch speaking are not brought over and instead rebel alongside the Walloons against the Dutch monarchy. So this dynastic conception, this Belgian identity, this distinct unit basically had forged a sense of particularism, a sense of otherness from the Netherlands. When you can say the severity of their cohabitation with the Northern Dutch basically had been exposed to them, they were more than willing to rebel. Now the precedent had been set in France with the deposition of King Charles, Charles the Tenth of France, and again we talk about this dynastic conception. The dynasty has renounced it. And now we have the true artificial creation, which is the Kingdom of the United Netherlands, which is really only there as a result of great power contrivance. And you can say that the emergence of a Belgian state is really, you can say, history returning with a vengeance, so to speak, to undo the real artificial creation, which was the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. And so out of that, we have the creation of a Francophone, Orleanist state. What do I mean by that? I mean, in France, Louis Philippe, the cousin of King Charles X, is made King of France under the idea that he become a constitutional monarch as a result of the July Charter, which forms basically the premise of a constitutional monarchy in France. He does not accept the title of King of France. He instead accepts the title of King of the French, in a similar way to what we saw with King Louis XVI between 1791 and 1792. In Belgium, effectively, there is a revolution, but they don't want to eschew the idea of having a monarchy. Instead, they want to invite a monarch who can guarantee Belgian independence. One of the early ideas floating around about the southern Netherlands actually joining in with the north was during the original Brabant Revolution in 1789, 1790. And the only reason that idea gained any traction was because the Belgians, so much as we can speak of them at that time, wanted to basically assert their independence from Austria and France. And of course, that failed and they were reconquered. But in this instance, the Belgians are trying to form a nation state, an independent nation state, and invariably, because Belgium sits at the axis point, the intersection between the Netherlands, between Prussia, between France, and between Great Britain, it obviously becomes an object of great power contrivance over to whom the throne is ultimately allocated. There are three contenders through the throne of Belgium: Eugène de Beauharnais, the son of Louis Philippe, a direct Orleanist, and King and Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Leopold is an interesting character in the sense that he tried to become king, or rather Prince Consort of Great Britain, because he married Princess Charlotte. She died in 1817, meaning that Queen Victoria would ultimately inherit, not Princess Charlotte. He was then offered to be the first king of Greece, and he wisely, perhaps in hindsight, realized that that was a bad idea because Greece was poor. It was completely dominated by foreign powers in terms of it being a relatively artificial construct. And the situation in Greece was so precarious that the candidate they essentially settled on, who was King Otto von Wittelsbach, was deposed, and then he was replaced by the Danish royal family, which came from Holstein. So Leopold made the wise decision in terms of accepting the Belgian throne, because his dynasty has actually been successful and survived there for 200 years. In terms of going back to Nigel Farage's original point about Belgium being an artificial creation, about the Brits doing it, this is the point which essentially what one draws to, the scrap of paper and the idea that the, quote, British candidate had become the King of Belgium. I think for the Belgians, it was perhaps the best option they had, even though, again, we're talking anachronistically, the king, the new King Leopold, King of the Belgians, was a Protestant. The new monarchical situation was based on the Orleanist settlement in the terms that one has a king, but one has a constitutional monarchy. And effectively, as we saw with the diminution of the powers of the governors during the Habsburg Empire, there is a delicate balancing act between the power of the governor, between the power of the Catholic Church, and the power of the bureaucracy and of the estates, who basically coalesce into a francophone bourgeois liberal elite. So in many ways, you can say that Belgium is a revolutionary construct born of the revolutions of 1830, based on this idea of a revolutionary French-inspired Orleanist national self-deterministic monarchy, the King of the Belgians, and yet it is also the synthesis of all of these historical anachronisms that make up Belgium before that point, this delicate balancing act between the church and all the sources of executive power. And in that sense, the monarchy becomes indispensable as Belgium, as if it were a dynastic construct, in a way that, say, for example, the monarchies of Sweden, of Denmark, even of the Netherlands become relatively, you can say, almost made obsolete by the fact that they are completely superseded by their parliamentary institutions. In the case of Belgium, the monarchy, despite again being a monarch by popular acclaim, not by right of God, not by right of territory, but as King of the Belgians, as an act of self-determination, he becomes indispensable to the nation, to the national project, as again restoring this new dynastic construct, albeit on a completely different level playing field. And someone's already said that Belgium was a vassal state to England and France. No, that's not true. First of all, you can't be a vassal state to Belgium and France, to both England and France, because they weren't allied during this point. Indeed, during the period between 1831 and 1839, there was a period where Talleyrand, the foreign minister of France, suggested a division of the territories, a division of territories between Wallonia, the Netherlands, and also the idea of creating a free state in Antwerp, which would be handed over to Britain. Obviously, that would mean a territorial annexation of Antwerp, at the expense of the Netherlands. But the reason, again, the Netherlands survived is because Leopold basically demonstrated himself in Belgium to be the least worst scenario in this case. So long as Belgium was independent, so long as Belgium was neutral, and so long as Belgium was secure and stable, it could basically keep all the great powers apart. It could prevent France from going off and conquering the left bank of the Rhine in terms of Prussia, and Britain and Prussia and France would act as guarantors. It was not simply a British intervention to create a Belgian vassal state. No, that's not true at all. Rather, Belgium presented itself to the world as a fait accompli. Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha comes in and he accepts the position of King of the Belgians with all of these qualifications, etc. And Belgium is basically able to make itself into a European necessity. And that is what we mean by the great power ratification of the London Protocols. It is better to have a stable Belgium than an unstable United Kingdom of the Netherlands. We will not allow the Netherlands to come back and reconquer this territory, because ultimately the Netherlands has proven that it's incapable of holding this territory. And so long as it remains a flashpoint, then there will become the excuses of Prussia and France and Britain to annex the territory over and over and over again. So yes, you can say that King Leopold of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was a British candidate. Yes, he certainly was. He wasn't a member of the Napoleonic family in the case of Eugene de Beauharnais. He also wasn't a member of the House of Orleans in terms of France, and he was and would later be firmly entrenched in terms of the British establishment, because he was both the uncle to Queen Victoria and he was the uncle to Prince Albert, the Prince Consort. And yet he was able to use the British and influence the British, perhaps disproportionately to how the British were able to influence the Belgians. So that is the point of inception of Belgium as a state, which has continued despite its occupations up until today. And to reinforce this, I have an article by Aristide Zolberg, The Making of Flemings and Walloons. And as with all of these articles, you can read them in the description. I always do the citations, the sources I read. It is not necessary to assume the existence of a Belgian nationality to account for the emergence of Belgium in 1830. Again, that's a point of contention, but we'll go into this. The formation of Belgian political community is attributable to secular processes which stemmed from decisions made mostly out of the region, but on balance subjected it to common political experiences, and its gain of political independence at the time comes from an interplay between the inclinations of a large segment of the regional political class founded on their specific interests and the contemporaneous international system. Like I said, that is the conventional view. But as I've been at pains to say, the reason that Belgium existed and came to exist as the territory that it did is as a result of this long historical continuity of it being a dynastic construct, and then basically being able to represent this composite of all of these counties and duchies, and specifically of a Catholic identity, and of the power of the estates coming to the fore in the Belgian Revolution of 1789, and of the rebellion against the Dutch in 1830. Yes, it is incontrovertible that there was an interplay between various interests, local interests who had an investment in creating a Belgian state, the interests of Leopold in becoming a king, and also, like I said, it becoming and making itself a European necessity by forming basically a no man's land, the neutral zone where formerly it had been a battleground. So in that sense, again, it is correct, but to say it is mainly as a result of outside influences, I think, is completely disingenuous. Otherwise, like I said, it would purely be an artificial creation. The sociological dimension of the linguistic segmentation explains more than any other factor why language differences played a minimal political role during the country's formative years. United by a regional patriotism directed both against the Netherlands and France, the Belgian political class experienced little difficulty in establishing a culturally diverse country where a majority spoke Flemish and most of the other Walloon, a unitary regime whose sole official language was French. So we are essentially going to be francophone, but we are going to be very distinct from France based on this legacy of independence. And you can say even hostility, given the fact that France did occupy the territory, that France had invaded Belgium so many times during the course of Louis XIV. If anything, like I said, the irony, French speakers being alienated as a result of constantly having to fight the French. The process of consolidation of the Low Countries, an area which encompassed contemporary Benelux and part of northern France, Benelux, of course, being the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium, began in the 14th century and was completed in 1543, when it was governed as a dependency of Spain under a system which resembled the modern colonial pattern of indirect rule. Again, this is again written from the point of view of a political scientist. It's a very interesting article, but like I said, the modern colonial pattern of indirect rule is unfair, given the fact, like I said, it was Spain. The Spanish Empire actually appeared by the House of Burgundy moving to Spain and not vice versa. And the system of indirect rule and this whole idea of a colonial pattern, no, these were pre-existing systems, effectively, which were dependent on Spain in the same way it was a dynastic construct, not in the same way that Spain was operating a colonial empire at that time within Europe itself. But the upheavals, and like I said, the dynastic element really shows to dismantle that whole argument. The upheavals of the second half of the 16th century had as their outcome the establishment of an armistice line which separated the independent United Provinces north of the river deltas from the southern provinces, which, with the exception of Liège, attached to the Holy Roman Empire, were reconquered by Spain. The armistice line, which with minor modifications became a permanent political boundary for 2 centuries, was drawn from the north of the linguistic line, thus leaving a substantial Flemish-speaking population in what became known as the Spanish Low Countries. Although it is not clear to what extent the regions north and south of the linguistic line constituted distinct cultures or societies prior to the end of the 16th century, a controversial historical subject towards the end of the period covered in this paper, and to which we shall return, It is certain that the political boundary settled at the time was determined by the separate development and independent Spanish Netherlands for 2 eventful centuries. So effectively, the boundaries are created as a result of the Dutch revolutions in the 16th century, Dutch Revolution in the 16th century. Whatever the religious orientation of various geographical and sociological components of the southern provinces may have been in the 16th century, Catholicism was imposed by Spain in the 17th century. Again, it wasn't imposed by Spain so much as you can say it was reinforced, reconsolidated by Spain. After losing part of their southern territory to France, the Spanish Low Countries, a distinct political unit containing a homogeneous Catholic but linguistically diverse population, came under Austrian control at the beginning of the 18th century. From about 1750, as part of a strategy of modernization from above, the Austrians developed in their westernmost possession, which had always shown signs of economic development, an elaborate network of administrative, judicial, and religious bureaucracies, with a system of secondary education designed to facilitate recruitment of appropriate personnel from the ranks of the nobility and the bourgeoisie. The language which they used for these activities was French. And this is spurred on by the fact that during the reign of Mary Theresa in particular, you have the Spanish court style, which is superseded by the French language and the French use of the language in court. In this case, Belgium and the Spanish and the Austrian provinces simply follow the mold that we see in Europe all the way from Paris to St. Petersburg. As these policies produced a spurt of economic development, the new bourgeoisie, even in the major cities of the north, such as Brussels, Ghent, and Antwerp, increasingly adopted the French language and culture promoted by a German court as their own. Again, emphasis, German court misleading. It wasn't German speaking in Vienna. It certainly wasn't German speaking in Brussels. After an abortive revolution, 1789-90, during which the United Belgian provinces, including Liège, separated from the rest for 2 centuries, it emerged briefly as a state, claiming international sovereignty, and the region was then annexed by France and transformed into 9 départements, you can see on the image on the left. The economic, administrative, and cultural transformations launched by the Austrians were vastly reinforced during nearly 20 years of French occupation. By 1814, French was the common language of Belgian cities, regardless of their sphere of activity and region of origin or residence. It was also, therefore, the language of upward mobility. Had France prevailed, the use of Flemish in the Belgian departments may have waned considerably during the 19th century, under the impact of a determined French commitment to cultural and linguistic homogeneity as the sine qua non of international integration, as occurred in many parts of France with itself with respect to its Flemish, Breton, or Provençal populations. As it was, however, the 9 departments were incorporated into the Kingdom of the Netherlands in 1815 as part of the Vienna settlement. The intense period of French assimilation was thus followed by a 15-year period during which the Belgian region was ruled by a Dutch government, which also aspired to achieve linguistic homogeneity, but in the region's other language. Less forceful than the French, however, the Dutch were also aware that their linguistic aspirations went against well-established trends among the Belgian elites. They concentrated intermittently on the French of the official establishment of the Dutch north of the language line, a zone which included Brussels, and introduced Dutch into a curriculum of secondary and higher education. On the whole, ideological divisions among Belgian elites and their differentiated economic interests played more important a role in defining the positions of various groups towards the Netherlands regime and its policies than did residents in Flemish or Walloon regions in Belgium. Although the Church and political Catholics actively opposed the Protestant and Masonic Dutch establishment from the very beginning, mostly because of its educational policies, the industrial and commercial bourgeoisie of the major cities, many of whom were Masons, had been pro-French, saw the reconstruction of the Low Countries as a great opportunity for economic development and religious liberalization. Both Catholics and liberals, as they were then commonly identified, steadily opposed intermittent attempts to extend the official language of the Netherlands to the southern part of the realm and particularly to Brussels. In the second half of the 1820s, there was a rapprochement between a new generation of liberal Catholics and a new generation of liberal freethinkers, more concerned with political freedom than economic development. At the end of a decade, a union of oppositions was able to channel the popular discontent produced by economic dislocations, accompanying the economic development in opposition to Dutch rule. The July Revolution in France gave Belgium an opportunity to exert greater pressure on behalf of a liberalizing regime and of administrative autonomy for the south. Dutch reactions to the upheavals in Belgium during August and September of 1830 contributed to the transformation of more limited demands into a declaration of independence. Claiming authority over the area encompassed by 9 former French departments, the Belgian provisional government obtained some support among the English Whigs and thereby was reluctantly accepted de facto recognition by the European powers at the end of that year. Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a British candidate, became King of the Belgians in July of 1831. A Dutch onslaught 1 month later was repelled with French assistance. In 1839, Belgium obtained legal recognition in exchange for a settlement which entailed, among other things, the loss of about 7% of its population, mostly Flemish and German speakers. In spite of its vulnerable geographic location, Belgium became a neutral European island whose territorial integrity was founded on international law and the balance of power. Hence, like I said, one of the cornerstones of modern Belgian national identity up until the Second World War being this notion of independence. And indeed, independence breeds sovereignty in the same way we can look at Switzerland and say a cornerstone behind Swiss nationality is the idea of armed neutrality. Belgium, you can say, is a northern Switzerland, and this, of course, wasn't something that was lost on, say, for example, German military planners during World War I, over which neutral country to invade France via either Switzerland or by Belgium, rather than crossing over into Lorraine proper. And this is to say that Belgium was basically a dynastic, monarchical alternative to Switzerland. While Switzerland has its historical identity forged by the union of the cantons, and the perpetual neutrality was brought in during the 16th century at the height of the Italian wars. In the case of the Belgian, basically Belgium ascertaining this idea of neutrality, again, it goes back to this idea we have renounced Belgium, the Habsburgs, as a dynastic territory, and what essentially is left, has been presented to the world as a fait accompli. Our de facto recognition of it has now become a legal recognition of it. And now we are going to assume our mantle as a sovereign, independent, and neutral nation, and not a vassal state. When united, these diverse elements which led the Belgian Revolution have been identified as a system of Belgian patriotism, a concrete sentiment founded on different motives among various groups whose geographical and social diffusion in the course of the struggle against the Netherlands was traced. It was probably strongest among the popular and middle classes in Belgium, where the upheaval started, as well as in Liège and other Walloon towns, but was also widespread in the rural areas and in the Flemish provinces, which supported the national revolution once it got in its way. A sociologist known as Stengers found that only a small segment of opinion within the political class, mostly in the Walloon cities of Verviers, Liège, and Mons, advocated reunion with France, and that there were more important segments, especially strong in the leading industrial and commercial cities of the Flemish region, Ghent and Antwerp, but evident also in Brussels and even in Liège, remained loyal to the House of Orange. Reunionism disappeared rapidly, while Orangism lasted. It is unlikely, however, that the latter was based principally upon linguistic and cultural affinity with the Netherlands. Almost entirely French-speaking, the Orangists feared the negative economic consequences of separation, and the dominant position within the Catholic Church was likely to achieve an independent Belgium. This distortion of opinion, found by Stengers, is confirmed by Witte's more recent quantitative study of communal municipal politics in the 20 largest Belgian towns from 1830 to 1850. This is all to say that this is the whole idea of this reunionism. It's this idea that there was a form of legitimism going back to Orleanism. In contrast to Orleanism, we have Orangism. Orangism being essentially the older iteration of this sort of loyalty to the house in the Netherlands. But this is really a nonsense because, of course, true legitimism in this sense would actually reference reobtaining some sort of Hapsburg connection, wouldn't it? Say, for example, if Francis put one of his blood brothers, the Archduke Charles or the Archduke John, on the throne. Of course, that doesn't really make any sense. So I find this whole notion of Dutch legitimism, again, it's a total misnomer if you're going to say that reunionism is a form of legitimism to return to this idea of the House of Orange being the real house of the Netherlands. as opposed to the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Basically, you can say if one is ridiculous, so is the other. So I think that's a very contentious way of looking at it, because this is very much looking at it as if history began in 1794, 1795, and that this dynastic conception of the Habsburgs doesn't play as much of a role, rather than this spontaneous unity created by all these disparate elements railing against the Dutch. Well, as I've tried to be at pains to say with my historical parallels and the referencing of this continuity of culture in the regions, that this actually goes back much further. And if we can speak of legitimism, it really should be directed towards the House of Habsburg. There was another category of Orleanists, however, for whom loyalism to the Netherlands had a different meaning. Occurring after the most intensive period of French linguistic and cultural penetration, Dutch rule revealed to the secular-minded urban middle strata of the northern part of Belgium, lawyers, school teachers, and middle and lower grade government officials, the hitherto almost unsuspected or actively repressed existence of modern literary and scientific culture in a standardized language almost identical to what was regarded as a mere dialect in Belgium. This exposure, together with such institutional innovations as the founding of the Dutch language teaching school in Flanders and the inclusion of Dutch literature in the curricula of state universities, provided the conditions for the emergence of a small cohort of Flemish-minded intellectuals, pejoratively called the Flamignants, soon after Belgian independence. For them, Orangism was more a matter of national identity, but the very connection between Flemish-mindedness and Dutch loyalism, as well as the non-bourgeois status of its advocates, reduced what little political leverage the Flamignants might otherwise have had on Belgian politics during this period of national founding. So yes, right from the beginning, there is this conception of Flemish distinctiveness. That in itself, you can say, was actually as a result, if we see the French occupation for 20 years as stimulating French domination in terms of its pursuit of homogeneity, when we look at the Dutch experience, it is essentially given this language diffusion and the expansion of the Dutch curriculum into the Flemish areas. It is that legacy which is able to manifest itself in terms of Flemish regionalism. And yet, it is only surface level. It wasn't so strongly ingrained as a result of the unsuccessful Dutch control of this region that it basically spontaneously breaks out into Flemish separatism en masse, like we see today. The Belgian founders translated their unusual condition into a contract formula for a parliamentary government that was unique on the continent. Far from democratic, since it was based on a restricted political franchise, the regime was nevertheless amazingly liberal for its time. Alongside freedom of religion, of education, of association, and of press, all of which reflected the compromises between Catholic and liberal unionists, the Belgian constitution stated, the use of languages spoken in Belgium is optional. It must be regulated by law and only in the case of acts by the public authorities and of judicial matters. But this guarantee of freedom of language was implicitly acknowledged by the country's linguistic diversity, was accompanied by a political class who unambiguously adhered to the view that Belgium, as a national state, must be unilingual, francophone, and that this should basically form the basis of a unitary state. Immediately after it declared that Belgium was independent, the provisional government decreed that French was the only official language of Belgium. After the constitution was adopted, Parliament repeatedly passed laws in French. There's another note to consider regarding this whole liberal association with freedom of religion, like going back to the period of the Habsburgs and the Masonic influences, the origin of humanism in the Flemish Enlightenment with figures such as Erasmus, and then you go back to the Masonic influences, the Catholic Enlightenment vis-a-vis the enduring sort of presence of the Jesuits, and the Netherlands, Belgium basically being a Jesuit colony in some sense. If we understand the religious freedom, it basically allows for this contest of power to begin between the liberal secularists and the French Catholics, or rather the Belgian Catholics. And really, this is mirrored in France almost perfectly. In France, to be a secularist is to be on the left, and to be a Catholic is to be on the right. That's basically the same situation in Belgium. The difference is, however, is that the secularists more or less won that campaign in France by the beginning of the 20th century, whereas that campaign went on in Belgium for much longer. And there's another more practical reason as to why there was religious freedom. If we go by the basis of a traditional dynastic maxim of Cuius regio, eius religio, that the state religion is determined by its ruler. If the state religion is determined by its ruler, then obviously it should be Protestant. You can't really have a Protestant king and have a state religion which is also Catholic. And so in this case, you can say religious freedom is almost there by necessity to accommodate this fact. And it is only later that the House of Saxe-Coburg got to formally convert to Catholicism. And then you end up with someone like Baudouin, who is, just to point out in terms of the Catholic nature of the sort of Belgian sort of civilization, so to speak, or Belgian culture more precisely, he's actually been considered for sainthood within the Catholic Church, just to illustrate that. Now it comes to the idea of religious disparity, combining this whole notion of linguistic disparity. I've already mentioned the comparison between the Masons on the one hand and the Jesuits on the other. There were many idiosyncrasies within Belgium that were mirrored within the whole context of the Austrian Empire itself. Of course, the Austrians came down very hard on this during the Jacobin period. They banned the use of Freemasons, albeit Joseph II had already tried to heavily regulate them. But there are many levels in terms of how the religious disparity actually plays out over the regional lines and how regional conflicts enforce this idea of the religious diversity, more so than can be simply said that everyone is Catholic in some sort of monotonous, homogeneous way. It is difficult to ascertain to what extent Flemings and Walloons differed before, during, and after industrialization of Belgium with respect to other spheres of life, which often related to the traditional modern dichotomy, such as religious outlook, family structure, basic socialization, more generally, and such allegedly dependent variables as need, achievement, or empathy. Basic research on these subjects, with the exception of the demographic aspects, has either been undertaken or simply has not come to light at this time. Although almost all Belgians were nominally Catholic at the beginning of the 19th century, they have remained so down to the present. They differed not only with respect to the frequency of their practice, but also with respect to their fundamental religious orientation, probably in a manner paralleling differences found in France. These differences were clearly manifested at the level of the political class and provided one of the foundations for the industrialization of the liberal and Catholic political camps. It is widely believed, however, that the Flemings as a whole retained a higher frequency of Catholic practice than the Walloons, and that their Catholicism was more austere and puritanical, more fundamentalist, in keeping with the fact that Jansenism originated in Flanders. Well, again, as has already been alluded to with this idea of Jansenism, there are many elements of Jansenism which are crypto-Calvinist, effectively. This idea of the grace that's irresistible, subtle nods to things like predestination, but then you can say more hardcore puritanical elements in that sense when we talk about the pervasiveness of venal sin, which precludes one's ability to ingest the host and things like that. But it's interesting, isn't it, an idea to consider that Catholicism is stronger in Flanders, because again, that, if anything, reinforces the idea that whilst linguistically we are closer to the Dutch, religiously we are actually more determined in our opposition to the Northern Dutch than we are to the Walloons, whose Catholicism, say for example, isn't so firmly entrenched. And part of that is down to the fact that we have a industrialized or increasingly industrialized Wallonia, where you see the ascent of socialism in areas like Liège, and then you have a nominally widely agrarian Flanders, which for the most part has been cut off from the benefits of colonial trade from the Netherlands and the East Indies, etc., especially as we see cities like Antwerp, which are routinely blockaded and denied their access to the sea due to the incredibly disadvantageous geography of Belgium, which basically ensures that the Netherlands can basically place cities like Antwerp on a permanent blockade. So how do we sort of go on from here? It's important to talk about the Industrial Revolution. I mentioned earlier that Belgium was the second nation in the world to really industrialize, and this carries on apace during the 1830s, the 1840s. There was already a prosperous economy that had been cultivated during the Hapsburg period and before. In some senses, you can say that the Netherlands was far more urbanized than someone like Germany, comparatively. Germany, which is still disunified at this point. Indeed, if you go back to figures in titans in Belgium historiography, like Henri Pirenne, who would argue about the origins of nationalism in the medieval cities play such an important role in terms of the Flemish economy, with the textile industries in Ghent and Bruges, and the first stock exchange in terms of Antwerp. If we're going to look at the origins of medieval cities, you can look at, say, for example, the Hanseatic League. One can look to the Dutch Confederation, the United Provinces. One can also look to the Flemish towns and see that these are major hubs of economic activity, urbanization. Nevertheless, ironically, it is Flanders that becomes relatively agrarian, whilst in the south, in cities such as Liège, we see a vast effort to industrialize the city and to industrialize those areas. And you can really say that another reason that Belgium survives, despite being disconnected from the colonial enterprises of the Dutch during the first decades, is that the agrarian Flemish Dutch-speaking economy decides to pin itself to the advantages afforded by the burgeoning industrialization in Wallonia. So Wallonia, French-speaking Wallonia, becomes disproportionately wealthy, not just in terms of the relationships within Belgium, but also in terms of the whole sort of context of Europe. Belgium produces vast amounts of raw materials that can aid in facilitating, such as coal, industrialization, which actually means that the loss of Belgium to the French Empire is one of the things that I believe holds France back vis-a-vis someone like Germany, and why the logic, of course, of France annexing Belgium was made all the more desperate after the Belgian Revolution. And of course, the knock-on effect is not only just the integration and dependence of the agrarian Flemish economy on the industrial economy of the South, but of course, it's another legitimating factor for the monarchy. As the executive government can basically present to the world that Belgium is stable despite the linguistic disparity, that Belgium is wealthy because of industrialization. Industrialization will come to Belgium before it will come to Germany or before it will come to France. This also means that Belgium is actually richer than the Netherlands to the north, despite the Dutch colonial empire. So, in many senses, Leopold can present Belgium as a model state. And this means that Belgium is actually insulated from the effects of the revolutions of 1848. Really, the only countries in Europe that are really insulated from the effects of the revolutions are Britain, Belgium, and Russia. And that, in a sense, is really a testament to the Belgium political establishment and system that was created in 1831, that despite all of its idiosyncrasies, and now you can say this prevalence of a French urban liberal culture that's attempting essentially to dominate all aspects of society and see Flemish, see the Dutch language as something provincial, and indeed at worst, something which is there to facilitate the use of fifth columnists or quote unquote Orangist legitimists to take these territories back and inform them as part of the Netherlands. All of these things basically have fallen by the wayside. Regarding things happening in Switzerland in 48, yes, actually, in 1848, the new constitution of Switzerland was actually drawn up. So there was a revolution in Switzerland, as far as I remember, in 1848, which created the new Swiss constitution. There was also a precursor to it in terms of the Helvetic Republic, which was created under the auspices of Napoleon. Now we come to the imitation of the Netherlands and Britain in terms of establishing a colonial presence. During the reign of Charles VI, during the Habsburg period, Charles VI had attempted to form something called the Ostend Company, which would have been a private commercial colonial enterprise by the Austrian Empire, which would have tapped into the resources which basically the economic areas which other European powers in the West Indies and East Indies hadn't really paid attention to, namely China. In fact, the Ostend Company were pioneers in importing Chinaware into the rest of Europe. And this was all coming out of Ostend, Antwerp, the cities in Belgium, which of course Belgium Austriacum, the Austrian Netherlands, etc. It was such a threat to British trade that as a result of the dynastic sort of issues going in with the pragmatic sanction in Austria at that time, the British, who were allies of Austria, compelled their ally to renounce their control over the Ostend Company, and thereby defeating a commercial and maritime threat. But this legacy of colonialism originating from Belgium specifically didn't die. Instead, it was restored under Leopold II. And Leopold II, again, is a testament to the awkward position that we have of the monarchy in Belgium, and how the monarchy in Belgium, in many ways, is actually more powerful than many other monarchies that we have in Europe today, and even in the context of the period at the time. Because Leopold II had no interest in establishing a colony which would be administered by his parliamentary government. Instead, Leopold II, by right of his claim as King of the Belgians, wanted to establish his own personal Free State of Congo in order to extract massive amounts of rubber, in order to basically finance a vast personal fortune. It's only with his death in 1909, and I believe it's in 1910, that the colonial empire is actually annexed into Belgium itself. And later that colonial empire, we have added to it areas like Rwanda and areas like Burundi, concessions in China, etc., which aren't actually lost until the 1930s, etc. So now, at the point of the First World War, Belgium has a colonial empire. It's not just an independent state. And going back to this whole notion of neutrality that I brought up, and why it defines Belgium, part of the whole basis of King Leopold II receiving Belgium was to act as a buffer zone between French expansion, Portuguese expansion, British expansion, and German expansion within the region. Congo, if you look at it on a map, I don't have it up here, but if you look at it on a map, is basically this massive area in the center of Africa, which is effectively a no man's land between all of these regions. And it so happens to be demarcated specifically as the personal realm of the Kingdom of the King of Belgium. The reason I bring this up is because as it'll later be annexed into Belgium in 1910, the Belgian Empire is also fulfilling that function of separating the major powers of Europe from fighting each other in Africa, as it is also in Europe. So amazingly, that position of neutrality is now being replicated onto another continent, just something to consider. But now I want to talk about the burgeoning sense of nationality conflicts on the eve of the First World War. And here I'm coming back to Zolberg's article. Viewed from the vantage point of the Belgian political establishment at the beginning of the 20th century, trends were mildly encouraging. Whatever the Flemish regionalists might say, the fact was that an expanding segment of the Flemish-speaking population was acquiring a knowledge of French demonstrated in their acquiescence in the liberal assimilationist formula. They had been institutionalized during previous decades. The French-speaking minority north of the language line was growing, particularly in the dynamic cities. The fairness of the bilingual status of the Flemish provinces was confirmed by the fact that their inhabitants generated genuine demands for public services, including education in French. The availability of such facilities in turn eased further movement towards French culture as the Flemings finally modernized. The increasingly French character of the capital city's own population was a reassuring counterweight to the grant of official parity to the Flemish. On the whole, in spite of the Flemish demographic thrust, while the Catholic Party partially welcomed this, and that again is because of the nominally more Catholic Flanders vis-a-vis Wallonia and the growing socialist movement, Belgium would be able to maintain, under conditions of mass politics, its traditional French-dominant national identity. Within the Austrian Empire at this time, we have the creation of a Reichsrat, which was an Austrian parliamentary building. And basically, I've said on other streams that it was a constitutional farce baked into the Austrian Empire. The Belgian state is a parliamentary democracy, in some senses mirroring Britain, albeit with a far more active monarch, despite not being a sacred monarch, being a monarch only by right of national self-determination as king of the Belgians. But nevertheless, despite the split down the middle of Dutch speakers and French speakers, it is the general assumption that French as a language is so dominant in terms of civic life that a parliamentary democracy, a unitary state which has not become federal yet, it should be pointed out, is able to survive these conditions in a sense that when you look at Austria, the nationality conflicts are actually tearing the Austrian Empire apart. Viewed from a Flemish vantage point, however, the trends were disastrous. Among the Flemings, the backwardness of the Flemish region had been attributed for some time to the fact that the upper classes were separated from by their language. In Antwerp and Ghent, as well as perhaps in lesser cities, so long as upward mobility was relatively limited, its pace was probably at one with gradual movement into the upper French user group. As they began to experience economic development, however, the middle class expanded, and although more of them became French users, upward mobility probably outran the acquisition of French culture. It was during that very period that Flemish-minded pressed their claims for the institutionalization of secondary education in Flemish, something that had been achieved during the Dutch administration. By the beginning of the 20th century, there were probably numerous families in these cities who would claim to middle-class status founded on economic and educational achievement that was jeopardized by the fact that they had not been assimilated into French culture. This type of status incongruity often leads to the rise of challenges to an existing culture of stratification, i.e. attempts to alter the criteria on which the stratification system rests. It's interesting to consider that there is almost a direct parallel to this specifically within a region of Austria, which is within the Kingdom of Bohemia and Moravia. In the Kingdom of Bohemia and Moravia, which is more or less the modern borders of the Czech Republic, there was a German dominant culture and strata that had existed in the same way that you can say that a Belgian continuity goes back in terms of its specific nationhood or statehood at least to 1598. After the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, Bohemia and Moravia had been dominated by a Catholic German-speaking culture. And that, in a sense, means that in order to advance within political life in places like Prague, in Bohemia and Moravia, one needs to speak German. This also means that many Czech speakers effectively have become bilingual. In an attempt to appease the Czech nationalism within Bohemia and Moravia, within Austria, which is far more advanced, by the way, than the Flemish nationalism that we see in Belgium during this time, one of Franz Josef's ministers, Bedeni, has this brilliant idea of making the administration in Bohemia and Moravia officially bilingual, which instantly disempowers the entire sort of German elite who have no sort of compulsional interest in terms of speaking speaking Czech. So it's interesting to consider that these exact issues were permeating, albeit handled with much less success than they were being handled in Belgium. It was to a large extent in Antwerp and Ghent that a new secular-minded generation educated in Flemish in public secondary schools, as a result of the reforms instituted a generation earlier, produced many of the individuals and groups who formulated and sustained a new Flemish ideology. In the absence of higher rungs in the educational ladder, they faced a linguistic dead end, and more generally, it was this stratum that experienced most acutely the lasting stigma attached to their culture in Belgium. Whether or not they were Democrats by inclination, they could not hope for a solution to their problems without formulating a program which associated their situation with that of a people. But now the population was beginning to modernize, it was beginning to become more francophonic. Furthermore, under conditions of mass politics, the growth of the French north of the language line would reduce the weight which the area might otherwise carry in Belgian political process. The new Flemish cultured intellectuals were the aspiring elite of a seemingly dwindling people. Around the turn of the century, a succession of Flemish intellectuals stressed in somewhat different ways the futility of a movement that was merely linguistic in its orientation, i.e. that Flemish culture seems to be far more diminished, and you can say, again, focusing on T.S. Eliot, regionalist, in the sense basically it's trying to reassert a linguistic identity rather than something that actually exists in terms of political culture. The Flemish movement was, or should transform itself into, a social movement directed first of all against the bourgeois French-speaking of Flanders. Furthermore, the Flemish problem was not merely a means of achieving formal linguistic equality, but a matter of justice. Given the situation, this could not be achieved merely by granting rights to individuals. What was required was the modernization of the Flemish region in Flemish through economic, social, and economic development, capped substantively and symbolically by a Flemish language university, where a new responsible and responsive elite could be formed. These claims were founded on the rights of the Flemings as a people. It was not the result of the activities of the Flemish nationalists alone or Flemish regionalists alone, however, but as a consequence of the interactions between defenders and opponents of the status quo that the linguistic question in Belgium, which had been for the most part a matter of debate over specific policies concerning public services, was transformed into a profound ideological debate over nationality. All right. It goes on then to say that, here we are. Sorry, just lost my place for a second. That such debates had been common in Europe for the most of the previous century. Belgium, after all, expressed one at the very beginning, does not make nationalism a cause of the transformation that occurred in Belgium. Rather, the categories of discourse which nationalism spawned provided a generally available mould within the Belgians could argue among themselves over issues stemming from their own changing situation. Again, this whole notion that Belgium identity is something continually in flux and based on compromise upon compromise, anachronisms within anachronisms. An explicit integrative ideology, congruent with the orientation of the existing regime, was becoming more necessary in Belgium, as in the rest of Europe, as the extension of political participation and the reliance of mass armies for national defense generated the need to educate the populace within a common civic framework from which individual obligations could be derived. As traditional beliefs waned under the impact of modernization, the past became politically crucial. The framework therefore took the form of national histories, rapidly incorporated into educational curricula at all levels. It was partly in response to Flamingant stirrings that the Belgian national view was in the process of being formalized in the monumental Histoire de Belgique, 1893, written by Henri Pirenne, which began with an essay on the subject of nationality, patterned explicitly of de Renon's, and it was in turn in response to Pirenne and his epigons that the Flamingists stressed an alternative interpretation. A major point of contention concerned the causes and consequences of the separation of the Low Countries at the end of the 16th century. In his initial plan, Pirenne stressed that the early history of Belgium cannot be extricated from that of the Low Countries region more generally, but from 1598, the unity of political development and civilization is broken forever. Two different states, two distinct nationalities come into being, Belgium and the Netherlands, having henceforth nothing in common, according to Pirenne. One could easily conclude that Belgium was therefore a country whose population spoke more than one language, but was united by a common secular experience. It constituted one nation, one people, for whom 1830 was an inexorable outcome, and for whom bilingualism was an equitable settlement. In the fourth volume of his history, published in 1911, Pirenne demonstrated that because prior to the middle of the 16th century, the Flemish and Walloon southern provinces, the Low Countries, had more in common with each other than the Flemish had with Holland and Zeeland, the geographic outcome of the struggle was in accord with indigenous sensibilities. 1598 was the critical date because Archduke Albert was installed along with Isabella Clara with the general consent of the local elites. In other words, Pirenne is looking to Philip II and his designation of a sovereign authority in the form of Isabella Clara and Archduke Albert, and saying that in many ways, as I try to actually illustrate with my point, that there is continuity in terms of the synergy of the estates and the church and the executive power in terms of the governor or in terms of the king of the Belgians. The only major differences in terms of 1830 and 1831 is a new dynasty with all of this Orleanist sort of national self-deterministic French revolutionary gloss added to it, but it harkens back to something much older. And this, you can say that my view is very much informed by Henri Pirenne, if you have a chance to actually read his history of Belgium. It was as a result of the contacts with Flemish students in the very year of that publication that the Dutch historian Yale elaborated a counterposition. As he saw it, Perrin was a Walloon teaching history and French to Flemish students at the University of Ghent, who occupied an advanced post in a movement of penetration and conquest which French civilization, under the auspices of the centralized Belgian state, was carrying on in Flanders. The Belgian national view, Gerel believed, was complemented by the Little Netherlands view that his own countrymen had developed in the 19th century to rationalize the sentiment of 1839. In Gerel's hypothesis, which sought to undermine both positions, and which he also used as the foundation for a general argument concerning the role of accident in history, ethnicity expressed by way of language was the main source of cultural differentiation in the Low Countries prior to the 16th century. The regions of Germanic speech, grouped around the Flanders-Brabant-Holland core, responded positively to the Reformation. The French-speaking regions facilitated, but once Calvinism was stifled in France, remained mostly Catholic. Had history taken its natural course, there would have emerged a homogeneous Dutch-speaking, it's incorrect in terms of the English there, homogeneous Dutch-speaking Protestant entity north of the language line, leaving the Walloon provinces eventually to be absorbed by France. Instead, the actual line of separation was determined by the inability of the Spaniards to subdue Holland and Zeeland rebels protected by the river deltas. Rather than 1598, the fateful date was 1609, the year of armistice, when the Flemings were unwillingly separated from the remainder of their race, Stam. Hence, although the Netherlands was a true nation, Belgium was an artificial creation containing parts of two distinct nationalities, one which legitimately yearned to be reunited with its Dutch brethren, or would so if when the consciousness was raised. Now that is very interesting in terms of the sort of broad trajectory of 19th century and early 20th century national histories that again see the linguistic communities, the ethnic communities, and then in a sense try to retroactively claim a form of nationalism for those territories. The reason I believe that again Gerel's hypothesis is really sort of rather fascinating in a sense is that these ideas of these specific regions determined by religion and determined by language would inevitably lead to the division of a Protestant Calvinist north dominated by the Dutch speakers and a Wallonia dominated by France is again completely inconsistent with the historical reality that Flanders had historically been part of France and that Wallonia had been part of the Holy Roman Empire. And indeed, such attempts by France to expand at the expense of the Holy Roman Empire in the 17th century during the reign of Louis XIV were so bitterly resisted, they basically produced coalition war after coalition war, and ultimately the French had gained vast territories in Luxembourg, etc., but had to give away many territories with the Treaty of Nijmegen in 1697. So this idea that Wallonia, as a result of its Catholic predilections, could simply absorb itself into France, I think again it does a major disservice to the Habsburgs and the prevalence of the dynastic state. In many ways, we can see it's the prevalence of the dynastic state in the 18th century, in the 17th century, in the 16th century, that is far more persuasive than the idea of linguistic continuity. It's a reason, say, for example, that Prussia can exist, that Austria-Hungary can exist, that Bohemia-Moravia can exist, despite the vast amounts of religious disparities. So again, it seems that to say otherwise is basically to have a teleology of history, which is deterministic, i.e., Flanders was at some point more Protestant and it speaks Dutch, ergo it must become part of a Dutch nation state, rather than these regions essentially being as a result of the byproduct of history, effectively. Which is why I find Belgian nationality so fascinating, is because, like I said, it's not a nation state in the conventional sense. It is a nation state formed around common institutions, formerly the Catholic Church and to a less extent the monarchy, and a common historical connection, the unity through the dynasty, which is then sublimated into the House of Belgium, the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. And like I said, to do away with this is basically to form a purely ethnocentric, ethno-nationalist point of view, which discards, say, for example, these historically congruent elements. All of this is fascinating. But again, it's not so much the idea that there could have been a case made for larger parts of the Netherlands joining in. with the Dutch Republic. I don't believe that can possibly be in contention. Again, it's the idea that there is a natural vehicle to France absorbing the French-speaking areas and the Dutch absorbing the Flemish-speaking areas, which again, like I said, seems incredibly ahistorical because it seems to discount the whole sort of dynastic process of state building, all the way going back to Philip the Good, etc., the Burgundians, the Habsburgs, etc. To my mind, it seems historically incongruent and something that could only exist as an opinion from the 19th and the 20th centuries, where petty nationalisms were being fostered all across Europe, in some cases with everything from Flemish regionalism to Ukrainian nationalism was appearing in the 19th century in terms of being able to really explain this. So in terms of like what happens now, well, as I've already alluded to, we have the occupation of World War One. In the same way that Leopold was basically able to foster a regime which survived the revolutions of 1848, in the same way that Leopold II carved out a colonial empire, which was then annexed by the Belgian state, Albert, as you can see on the image on the right, is a soldier king. And he was a soldier king in the sense that only 5 years into his reign, he had to deal with the German invasion of France via Belgium. Rather than allow the German troops to cross, he saw this as a violation of Belgian neutrality and decided basically, of which Germany, Prussia was a guarantor, and decided to fight the occupying forces. This again goes back to the whole scrap of paper argument, that the whole reason Belgium exists was as a vassal state for the British, and that's why the British got involved. It's too tangential really to discuss why Britain got involved in World War One, but nevertheless to say it was an important pretext. And Albert actually fights the occupation throughout the entirety of the war. There is a small enclave in the west, it should be noted, in Flanders, where Albert is leading his troops. He's there on the battleground. He is not, doing essentially what most governments in exile do, fleeing to London, albeit there is a Belgian government in exile, which is removed from the German threat, which is formed in Le Havre. But Belgium fights under its king, Albert, and then it survives the occupation. Belgium, as it so happens, was actually the main target of the expansionist policies of the German Empire, because the German Empire was very much navally oriented under Kaiser Wilhelm II. And if Belgium was annexed into the Reich, then all of the ports of Belgium could effectively be there to host the German High Seas Fleet. So Belgium would have been the principal defeated party of World War I had the Germans won. But alas, the Germans didn't win, the Allies won, and by extension, therefore, Belgium won, despite the fact that Belgium was occupied for nearly the entirety of the war, even at the point of armistice in 1918. But again, this is an interesting moment in the sense that Belgium has, as a result of the war, abandoned this whole idea of European neutrality. It doesn't then re-emerge as a neutral nation as a result of victory. Rather, Belgium becomes an indispensable part of the Versailles settlement. And what do I mean by that? Belgium is a direct beneficiary from the war in the sense that it expands its colonial empire at the expense of Germany, East Africa, but it also expands into Germany itself, into a region known as Eupen and Malmedy. And you can say really it's this time that we have a concrete German identity, which is now evolving inside Belgium alongside the Flemish and the Walloons. And this, of course, is now the basis of federalism, basically seeing Belgium as a three-way sort of a linguistic state, as opposed to simply a two-way linguistic state. You can see that this in many ways would harken back to an ancient policy of dynastic expansion, that the ethnic makeup of these regions is less important than simply expanding the strategic interests of the sovereign. So in this sense, Belgium is acting like a conventional sort of kingdom in the sort of 18th century sort of Frederikian mold. If you go to this early map, you can say that, as with the Austrasian comparison on the left, there would actually be a logic, if Belgium is to be a state irrespective of its linguistic composition, of expanding its borders on the right to the Rhine as its borders in the left were the Somme. Indeed, the Somme was the traditional boundary of the region of Artois, which was formerly part of the Spanish Netherlands up until their conquests by Louis XIV in the 17th century. So there is, you can say, a dynastic idea of expanding Belgium's borders into the Rhine. And so why do the Germans accept this? And why is Eupen and Malmedy still part of Belgium to this day? Well, it actually follows on from something I mentioned on the previous Prussia stream I did, which is the idea that Prussia became indispensable to the Weimar Republic as a way to circumvent Rhenish Catholic nationalism. The idea that there was a large dispossessed Catholic population within Prussia who wanted to assert a new identity formed on Rhenish nationalism around the city of Cologne, who would then seek the protection of France. It is part of the extension of that nationalism that means that so many Germans in the far west of the left bank of the Rhine region are willing to accept Belgium sovereignty, because Belgium is basically seen as a Catholic parliamentary nation, unlike Prussia, which was seen as domineering through its Protestantism. And ultimately, actually, is the experience of Weimar, is the experience of the political instability, it is the experience of the Spartacist revolutions that actually means that many Germans are, weirdly enough, amenable to unification with Belgium. The referendum in 1925 that ultimately brings that region is, incredibly contentious, but it's not fair to say that a large section of the population wanted to become part of Belgium because it was basically seen as preferable to the alternative, which is interesting to consider that Belgium is now not only a representation of a anachronism, which is its linguistic disunity and it being able to survive as a national culture despite that, but that Belgium is actually annexing regions from Germany and seeing as preferable to an explicitly German-based linguistic nationalism. But nevertheless, this era in which Belgium is seen as part of the Versailles settlement under King Albert, during which Belgian troops actually occupy the Ruhr, they occupy the left bank of the Rhine. In 1830, both the French and the Belgians retreat from this position. And when Albert dies during a mountaineering accident in 1834, he is replaced by his son, Leopold III. Leopold III has already been mentioned in reference to the abdication crisis. But Leopold III is interesting in the sense that he, as with all of the Belgian monarchs, is an assertive and independent-minded monarch who has his own conception of foreign policy and what it means to be a sovereign in terms of his defending his country. What do I mean by that? In 1935, under the auspices of the new king, Belgium officially becomes neutral. During that time, we have the annexation of the Saarland, we have the remilitarization of the Rhineland under Germany, later we'll have the Anschluss, and Belgium makes the conscious decision to abdicate its role in the Versailles Treaty. Sorry, did I say 1834? I meant, I don't know what you're referencing, John, not real name. 1925 was the annexation of Eupen and Malmedy, in case I've made a slip up. I'm constantly making slip ups, so do correct me. But this is all to say that Belgium consciously rejects its role in the Versailles settlement and readopts its position of historic neutrality. By the time 1940 comes along, you can understand that Belgium is trying to do it for the same reason that it was trying to remain neutral in World War I, which was to avoid being occupied by the Germans or provoking the Germans into response. And of course, that doesn't go very well for the Belgians, as we all know. Both Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg will be occupied along with France in, the occupation of the Ruhr. The king died in 1934. If that's not clear, 1934, not 1834, if I said that by accident. Thank you. Where was I? Yes. So what's going on in Belgium at this time? Now we've had this royal revolution. We have the rise of one Léon de Grelle and his Rexist party. If we are to look at Belgium as existing as part of this interplay with Catholic politics, a liberal Francophone elite, and the monarchy, you can say that Rexism, which is actually based on Rex, king, and it was actually not Rexism specifically the Belgian monarchy, but Christ is king, as it was meant explicitly as a Catholic corporatist Belgian nationalist movement. It would later be modelled on fascism and would ultimately collaborate with Nazism. you can say that this was the Belgium attempt at trying to imitate something like the Austro-clerical regime under Dollfuss, or later we see Francoism within Spain, corporatism within Portugal, or corporatism within the Low Countries. There is a Belgium iteration of that under de Grelle, and it'll be rather interesting to see how a Belgium identity could have been essentially shaped by a Rexist government. But nevertheless, I believe that if Rexism is supposed to be a microcosm of right-wing Belgian nationalism, it shares with it all of its idiosyncrasies and contradictions. It never becomes a mass movement. It reaches its political zenith in 1936. It doesn't do well in subsequent elections. And when the Germans occupy Belgium in 1940, Rexism basically becomes a Wallonian allied movement to National Socialism. So all of these pretensions towards the integration of the Flemish Catholic populations with the industrial-speaking Wallonia, etc., that could be sympathized with this corporatist element of a new form of Belgium under the king, all of that's dispensed with. There is also the other consideration that the king decides to go against the wishes of his government, his elected government, and he surrenders to the Germans personally, believing that he has the right basically to capitulate the armies and he will not fight a government in exile. This causes a royal crisis where the head of state is asserting one policy, that Belgium has surrendered, and the government is pursuing another policy, which is that Belgium has not surrendered but will continue to fight in exile, and that is the precipitation of the royal crisis. There is another crisis going on. In the same sense that Rexism degenerated into Wallonian collaboration with Nazism, the Germans were seeking to dismember the state of Belgium. Again, as with Switzerland, Hitler viewed Belgium as a historical contrivance and was trying to annex the populations of Flanders, seeking again their German identity to become part of the Greater German Reich. And also, contrary to that idea, was the idea of actually expanding the Reichskommissariat of Flanders and Wallonia to annexing part of France, etc. There are a lot of schemes proposed, but as we saw in World War One, with the possibility of the Germans annexing Belgium, with Belgium being the principal loser in any eventual German victory, in the case of Germany in World War Two, it is very clear that their intent was to dismember and destroy Belgium forever. And yet, as we saw in World War One, in World War II, the Belgian identity and the cause of Flemish regionalism did not have the dramatic effect in terms of making the Belgian state impossible to resurrect after World War II. But as with the liberation of France, Belgium was also liberated by the Allies in 1944 until the end of the war in 1945, and then Belgium was reconstituted. So it survived its partial dismemberment. So why is Belgium in such a crisis today, given the fact that I believe I've made plenty of arguments, and I think there's a concise through line into Belgium being a community formed on culture, which has existed historically and represents so many fascinating anachronisms within the whole and idiosyncrasies within the grand sort of scope of understanding European nationalism. Well, one of the arguments I believe is that it entered into the European Economic Community. All of a sudden, the idea of Belgium as a necessity based on neutrality, separating the British and the French and the Germans, is now gone. Instead, Belgium is now the vehicle for something else, which is the policy of European West integration with all of the Western economies. And you can say in that sense that the whole notion of a Franco-Germanic center based around this Lotharingia is now nothing more than a appanage to the European Union. So that's one thing I think ensures that Belgium essentially is nothing more than a host country, a host city towards the European project. And as you mentioned, John, not real name, it also joins in NATO as well, NATO and the European Union. So any pretensions of Belgium neutrality are now lost. And you can say that there is no way that Belgium could survive in its neutrality, given the fact that as a result of World War II, the entirety of the Western European sort of central bloc is now being integrated into the European Union. Even countries like Spain, when we see the death of Franco and Salazar's Portugal, will also join the European Union. Then we have the issue of secularization. I've already alluded to the First Schools War, where we have the growth of Flemish nationalism and the consideration over what education do we have for universities and secondary education, what language is the constitution going to be in, what language do we pass all the legislation and the bills in. By the 1960s, and the 1950s, it blows up into a second schools crisis, which eventually spills over into the 1960s into the Flemish language disputes. And later, this leads the cause towards federalism. Now, why do I believe this is the case? As I've been at pains to demonstrate, the linguistic issue was basically placed on the back burner because Belgium had enough in terms of its other aspects of its cultural identity to allow it to supersede and transcend its linguistic divisions. But as Belgium is no longer a European necessity, by virtue of it existing essentially as a neutral country, all of a sudden, Belgium identity becomes superfluous. And then you have the abdication crisis. In 1950, having personally surrendered the Belgian army to Germany, Leopold, despite the fact I believe this is actually a completely sort of misreading of history, it was rather, again, a conception of royal prerogatives and the position of the Belgian king as the leader of his forces. He is seen as and derided as a collaborator, especially by the socialists in Wallonia within Belgium. However, he wants to return back and lead Belgium effectively as its king, and this precipitates a referendum. Interestingly enough, there's a referendum that takes place in Italy 4 years before, the referendum that ends the monarchy. In that referendum, it is the South, it is the agrarian parts of Italy, Naples and Sicily, that vote overwhelmingly to support the continuation of the monarchy. And it is the industrial areas in the North that vote to abolish the monarchy. And the Republic Constitution is favoured by a slim majority, and that ensures the modern Republic of Italy. In Belgium, the referendum wins. The king is allowed to come back, and with the overwhelming support of the Flemish population, if memory serves, around 74% of the Flemish population supported the return of the king, and there was a much less enthusiasm in Brussels region and in Wallonia. So you can understand, can't you, if you're looking at Flanders as having that particular connection to the monarchy, if you're looking at a more, again, distinctive Catholic, a Catholic sort of sense of identity in the north, which is able to distinguish itself from the Netherlands, we are Flemish because we are Catholic and we are loyal to the royal house, this dynastic construct, rather than we are simply Flemish in terms of our culture being derived from our language. You bring back your king with your overwhelming support, and then all of a sudden you have these industrial workers in Liège, in Wallonia, launching this general strike, and they confound the referendum result. They ensure that your king cannot come back and reign, and he has to abdicate, and later he'll be replaced by King Baudouin. You can understand, as a Flemish nationalist, that would basically justify all your fears that Wallonia is actually tanking the whole Belgian project, and you are effectively being punished for your loyalty to the whole Belgian system if the Socialist Party in the south can effectively dismantle the Belgian project, of which you are sort of connected through the church and you are connected through the monarchy. So that, in many senses, the abdication crisis is a watershed moment. And then we come to the connection again of the crisis, I believe, in, 1990, when Baudouin decided to abdicate over the issue of abortion. When it comes to that, again, it shows there is another constitutional crisis with the monarchy, because the monarch can no longer equate his role with being head of state and presiding over a government if his government basically introduces something which undermines the whole bedrock of the Catholic sort of church in Belgium. And so we have the temporary abdication, and then we have the schools dispute. So it is this idea, as I mentioned, all of these things, the integration into the European Union, which makes Belgium superfluous because of the lack of neutrality and the lack of it being a European necessity. We have the language disputes, which have been ongoing throughout this entire time, but they're simply accelerating due to a lack of other unifying signifiers. The abdication crisis. And now, on top of all of that, we have the vast the vast sort of transition of foreign populations, immigrants, Europeans coming in and treating essentially Brussels and the region around it as a stay-over state, effectively, that the entire country's population is basically contingent on the movement of peoples throughout the European Union. So, yes, that in many senses, I think, to me, explains why Belgium seems so tenuous. Belgium seems so anachronistic, because when you have removed everything and you're left with nothing but linguistic concerns, you do not have a historically contingent nation. Of course, you can look at it and say retroactively that Belgium was always fake, Belgium was an artificial creation, and that it was the contrivance of foreign powers. Well, hopefully, I've been able to explain this, that that is definitely not the case. But the crisis in Belgium, like I said, it's in many ways it's going to doom possibly the European Union project, but it's also indicative of how many other countries are trying to justify their own nationality if they are historically deracinated, like Belgium. However, there are, say, for example, I mentioned the crisis of the monarchy in the 1950s, and I mentioned the temporary abdication of Baudouin in 1990, which showed this continual friction between the monarchy. But nevertheless, the monarch, unlike in many other countries, is still indispensable to Belgium, because, as you can say, the actual disputes, the regional disputes, the linguistic disputes become more sort of vehement. The only thing uniting Belgium in this new federal constitution is the monarchy. And so it's during the crisis of 2007 and 2011 that really it's the monarchy that's holding Belgium together, despite the fact that you have a complete parliamentary paralysis during this period. That effectively means that any sense of a quote unquote democratic government is impossible. All right. I've completely lost my voice now, so that's where I'm going to leave it here today. Ask your questions now, and I'll read the one super chat. And if there aren't any questions, I'm going to get out of here. Judge Caligula Bushman for €6. Thank you very much. Thanks, AM. I'm going to argue with you. You have a point, but I still dream of a united Burgundian circle. Ever the defender of the lost cause, I guess. Well, in a sense, the Burgundian circle as part of the Holy Roman Empire? Or you mean Burgundian circle in the sense that it's Catholic and united behind a royal dynasty? I mean, you'll have to sort of explain what you mean in more depth in terms of being able to understand, the restoration of Burgundy, the lordship of the Netherlands that existed within the 16th century. Martyn calendar, why didn't they just name it Burgundy? They didn't name it Burgundy because Burgundy is an area within France. The reason Belgium is distinct from Burgundy is that it's not even continuous. The reason it was called Burgundy is because it was part of the House of Burgundy, in the same way that the Austrian Empire was called so because it was the house stemming from Austria. You could go into modern-day Ukraine and call it Austria. In the same sense, you can go into Belgium and call it Burgundy for the same reasons, because it was ultimately a dynastic construct. Right. John, not real name. I guess the question that I need answering is, where is the nation of Belgium? Nationalism purports that there was a silent nation, now allowed after periods of suppression. Where was that Belgium? Nationalism purports that there was a silent nation, now allowed after periods of suppression. Could you expand that view? I'm not quite sure what you're saying there, John, not real name. Any other questions? If Belgium were a metal, what would be its atomic number? I don't know. Something sort of relatively obscure. Yes, and as John, not real name, is saying, there was the Free County of Burgundy, the Franche-Comte, the Freigrafschaft, and there was the Duchy of Burgundy, which was part of the historic patrimony of France, and there was the Kingdom of the Aralat. If you want to find more about the history of Burgundy, I would look at a video I did, which was, I think it was called The Three Kingdoms of Burgundy, if I recall correctly. Right. Spasticus Autisticus says, no question, only appreciation for another amazing stream. Well, thank you very much. That's very generous. Judge Caligula Bushman again, the Burgundian Circle being the territory cut loose by Charles V from the Holy Roman. Yes, I understand what you mean. It's just, what would that mean in terms of quantifying it? Are you talking about a dynastic state? Are you talking about a composite nation in terms of, returning to the old sort of federalist model of the Duchy of Brabant and the County of Flanders and the County of Holland and the Republic of Frisia and the Bishopric of Utrecht, all that sort of thing? Is that what you mean by the Burgundian Circle, Judge Caligula Bushman? I mean, in a bizarre way, you can say the return to federalism could represent a return to history. But like I said, with so many elements of Belgium, the Belgium anachronism, it doesn't. Belgium being formed as a unitary state, but which in many ways would run contrary to this idea of Belgium being a composite nation. But then Belgium is also a parliamentary state, which means it has to be basically a process to be managed rather than some sort of autocratic form of rulership, which Belgium never had. So in many ways, that would seem idiosyncratic, and yet it is. In the same way that you say, oh, bring back Flemish regionalism, bring back federalism, and all of a sudden you're bringing back the whole composite nature of what it means to be Belgium as it was during the time of the Habsburgs and the Burgundians. And then you look at it and say, no, because these are based on explicitly linguistic lines, not historical lines at all. So, yeah. Any chance of a Switzerland stream? I don't know. I mean, you raise an interesting point in terms of the fact that Switzerland just broke its tradition of neutrality, and as a result was actually called a hostile nation by Russia. And I don't quite know why they did that. I don't know why they broke their whole diplomatic reputation to do that. Well, I also believe it was very unpopular within Switzerland and actually broke with the whole sort of basis of the whole sort of government by referendum. That's such a massive shift in terms of the whole ethos of Switzerland was basically done by the government, and as a result, there was a petition signed to redouble Switzerland's commitment toward armed neutrality. So, where is the old Belgium, like the old Gaelic island? Well, if you read T.S. Eliot, he then goes on to explain this whole idea of reifying and restoring dead nations, which is part of that regionalism. Of course, his contention is that these regions basically support each other's nationalisms by existing in constant friction with each other. The old Belgium, are you basically talking about Belgica as in this sort of great sort of Celtic sense of nationhood? Well, if that's the case, Belgica was subsumed into a Germanic and Frankish and sort of Frankish sort of fusion, as we saw with the rest of France. I'm not sure how much you can retain any sense of the old sort of Gaelic sort of Belgian people in the same way you can look at the French as Gauls. It would only be possible under a dynasty. Which dynasty would you have it, Judge Caligula Bushman? The House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, the House of Orange, or the House of Habsburg? Martyn calendar, that's not really pertinent to the stream, I'm afraid. All right, I'm going to call it there. I've completely lost my voice. All right, thank you, everyone.